likely that I have not. I wonder how often I can get that to refresh, that's all. Like if... Need access. Fresh cache. I don't know, we'll see what happens. See what happens. There's a classic. As long as none of this gives us Centrelink hold music. That could be traumatizing. It's just me. Copy. So, aside from this, today I'm just pottering around the house. I've got another load of washing to put out. Already got some towels out. Did the dishes. Needing some time just to decompress from doing a lot with family and having a stepkid over for a few days and their partner. So, you know, just relaxing in my own space again. Hopefully we're starting soon. I was hoping we'd start nicely at the end of a piece of music, but you know how it is.
Terrific.
Here we go, guys. Let's do it.
So I declare open this hearing of the Senate Community Affairs References Committee's inquiry into the extent and nature of poverty in Australia. And I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're on, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Extend that respect to all First Nations peoples, particularly any who may be joining us at any time today, and acknowledge that we're on stolen land. I'm Senator Janet Rice, the Chair of the Committee, and joining us via video conference we've got Senators Marielle Smith, the Deputy Chair, and Senator Slade Brockman, and via teleconference we've got Senator Tammy Tyrrell. And these are public proceedings being audio streamed live via the Parliament's website, and a Hansard transcript is being made. I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It's unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated by the Senate as a contempt. It's also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence. Witnesses also have a right to request to be heard in camera. I now welcome representatives in person in the room with us today from the Anti-Poverty Week, Carers Australia and the Anti-Poverty Centre. And I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. So for the Hansard record, will you please each state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today?
Hi.
Okay, yep.
I'm Toni Wren and I'm the Executive Director at Anti-Poverty Week.
Thank you, Ms Wren.
My name is Jay Coonan and I'm a co-coordinator and policy researcher with the Anti-Poverty Centre.
Thank you, Mr Coon.
My name's Kristen O'Connell and I also do policy and research and am a co-coordinator at the Anti-Poverty Centre.
Thank you, Ms O'Connell.
Alison Brooks, CEO of Carers Australia.
Thanks, Ms Brooke.
Sue Elderton, Senior Policy Officer, Carers Australia.
Thank you, Ms Elderton. Thanks for joining us today. So I now invite each organisation to make a brief opening statement and then we will ask you some questions. Thank you. So who would like to kick off?
I'd like to, if that's okay. Yeah.
Go.
I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people as the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on here today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to state that Anti-Poverty Week accepts the invitation to walk with our First Nations brothers and sisters in seeking a voice to Parliament enshrined in the Constitution. Long overdue, it's simply the right thing to do. It's also the smart thing to do, as we can't work together to tackle poverty without their voice. As Catherine Little, CEO of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Children's Peak, SNAIC, has said, when you look at all the investigations as a result of the despair we see in our communities, they all point to poverty. And that poverty absolutely is rooted in a lack of self-determination. Thanks for the opportunity to speak in person at the hearing. I appreciate you've got a very long day and you're going to hear some harrowing testimony from people who are trying to live as best they can while trapped in poverty. And that's in Australia, one of the wealthiest countries in the world. You're also going to have some significant evidence about the extent of poverty and solutions to it. But before we go into all that, I wanted to quote the great Nelson Mandela. Overcoming poverty is not a gesture of charity, it's an act of justice. The pandemic and the associated lockdowns shone a light on what is important for us as a society. It was a time when millions of Australians experienced the pain of having our health, income, freedom, our connection to others, maybe even our hope for a better future, diminished and constrained. And I know, Senator Rice, you were in Melbourne, so you were right at the heart of that. But poverty does all of that. Living in poverty is like living in a permanent lockdown. The response to the pandemic also showed us that if we increase JobSeeker and the associated payments, we can actually dramatically reduce poverty. Our submission and many others detail the remarkable improvement provided by the temporary coronavirus supplement. For example, child poverty was more than halved. Yet, as a parliament, we chose to reverse this. We chose a return to poverty, to trap millions of Australians and their children in poverty and impede their ability to thrive and be healthy. It's also important to understand that poverty in Australia is gendered, like violence. Women at the time of separation are punished with an inadequate system of support, and the consequences can affect their lives right through deep into retirement. For example, I'll give you one single mum that has come to our attention. Let's call her Cherie. She's 36. She's got 3 children, 7, 12 and 14. She's got a domestic violence order against her former partner, whom she left 5 years ago. She's one of thousands of women who were forced with the impossible choice of violence or poverty. She chose to protect herself and her children from violence. She now receives the parenting payment single and a carer's allowance because her youngest child is severely autistic. When that child turned 6, she was subjected to mutual obligations to look and work and look for work. In addition to the caring responsibility she has as a single parent for 3 children, Cherie studies full-time and works part-time. When her children were younger, her family's income support was cut twice because she was in hospital and was late to report to the shocking program Parents Next. This week, she will be transferred to JobSeeker from the parenting payment because her youngest child is turning 8. A child's birthday that is dreaded by thousands of women across Australia, thousands of mothers. Transferring to JobSeeker for Cherie means a loss of at least $100 a week in income support, plus a harsher income test so she will keep less of her earnings. So there'll be less income for her and her children due to this inadequate support system we allow to perpetuate. Our submission includes evidence from a 2020 London School of Economics paper which concluded that money itself makes a difference to children's outcomes. And I also thank the Australian Centre for Community Child Health for their submission to this inquiry, which includes some new US evidence just published last month from the Baby's First Year study, which conclusively shows giving money directly to mothers living in poverty promotes their baby's brain activity. Direct correlation. Again, I'll finish by quoting Nelson Mandela. There can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ms Wren, and thank you for your comprehensive submission as well.
Thanks, Senator Rice. I acknowledge that we're meeting on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land that's never been ceded. I pay my respect to all members of local First Nations communities. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about our submission and answer any questions you might have. Our submission focuses on Australia's 2.65 million unpaid carers and their experience of poverty. We're acutely aware that poverty impacts at the foundation level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This foundation includes food, shelter, dealing with extremes of heat and cold, and the ability to move around, basic physiological requirements. Without these things, the ability to achieve higher level needs, integral to a decent life, dissipates. These include a sense of safety, including economic safety, a sense of community inclusion, scope for framing and pursuing aspirations, and self-actualisation. As would be expected, we've focused on how providing unpaid care to someone with a disability, a mental health condition, a chronic health condition, who have drug and alcohol-related problems or who are frail and aged can drive many carers into long-term poverty and others to near poverty. The most significant driver of carer poverty is the inability to combine employment and providing substantial care, often over a great many years, which is the case for many of Australia's carers, and especially of the more than 860,000 primary carers. A large national carers survey conducted by Carers New South Wales in 2020 found that, combined with having to retire early to continue caring, nearly half of respondents reported having left the workforce due to their caring responsibilities. The second most common impact was much reduced working hours and more precarious employment. It's not surprising then that the 2018 survey of disability, ageing and carers found that primary carers were nearly twice as likely to be in the lowest income quintile as non-carers and twice as likely to rely on a government pension or allowance to meet their costs of living. With respect to income support payments, as of September last year, 302,444 Australians were in receipt of the carer payment, and just under a third of these were in private rental accommodation, which we all know is becoming harder and harder to access and has been subject to exorbitant increases in the rent demanded. In economic modelling undertaken in 2022, carers are shown to be, on average, $175,000 less well off in lifetime superannuation savings and around $400,000 worse off in lifelong earnings than those without caring responsibilities. In our submission, we reference research conducted by the ANU Centre for Social Research and Methods that found that of those dependent on government income support, people receiving the job seeker payments, the disability support pension, single parenting payments and the carer payment were at most risk of deep poverty, along with renters, single parents and young people. Carers cross several of these categories. The authors of the report acknowledge the unwillingness of successive governments to boost the base level of welfare payments subsidised by increased taxation, but identify what they describe as modest tax increases which have the capacity to cover a range of increases to welfare payments, contribute most to poverty. As an aside, we note that the Treasurer has announced he is open to policy changes in the tax treatment of people with very high retirement balances. We believe it's high time for an independent review of the base rates of income support payments. Finally, we've also commented on the additional non-discretionary costs of providing high levels of informal care support, including the rising costs of healthcare, and we draw attention to negative educational outcomes of caring on young carers, especially those in income-poor households, and their impact on future prospects. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms Brooke.
My name is Kristen O'Connell. I'm from the Anti-Poverty Centre, and we acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people and pay respect to elders past and present across the continent. We stand with all First Peoples in the quest for justice and seek an end to colonial violence, including that inflicted through the welfare system and the carceral system. Poor people in this country are not being left behind, we are being actively held back. We want to begin by thanking the hundreds of people who, despite the strain of living in poverty, have contributed their expertise to the many proposals included in our submission to this inquiry. We extend our solidarity to everyone living in poverty in and out of work. The purpose of this inquiry is to understand the extent and nature of poverty, but fact-finding does not help us eat or make rent now or into the future. We need a new, sophisticated measure of poverty for the 21st century, developed with unemployed advocates in a leading role and other people on low incomes as well. We need an independent body tasked with revising the poverty line, and we need Centrelink payments tied to it. But we can't wait for action. Immediate relief is desperately needed. We urgently need income support payments lifted to at least the Henderson poverty line like they were overnight in 2020. Poverty disproportionately harms First Nations people, trans folks, single-parent families, disabled people, older people and migrants. And we have heard enough from people who speak over and for us. Our recommendations are simple, clear and provide a phased approach to the poverty crisis that doesn't leave us languishing in deep poverty while wealthy people pontificate about a patchwork of programs that aspire to shift the dial in 1 or maybe 2 generations. This government has had a lot to say about its values, but it's done little to live up to that rhetoric. Yes, people need health, housing, education, training and employment supports, but these supports mean little and they don't succeed when we can't afford to live. The Albanese government says it cares about people who are struggling, but it ignores the blindingly obvious policy choice that would do the most for us. There's no such thing as a silver bullet for addressing so-called disadvantage, but there is something that comes pretty close. Poverty and mutual obligations are barriers to work. If you want to help people find and keep a sustainable job, abolish mutual obligations and raise the rate. In the past 4 years, there was a 27% increase in people seeking help at homelessness services. If you want to help people get and keep a roof over their head, raise the rate. More than 60,000 women aged 15 to 24 years old who experienced violence in 2019 were in financial hardship. If you want to help people leave and stay out of violent homes, raise the rate. People on poverty level payments, talk to a lot of people, die by suicide at roughly twice the rate of the general population. If you want to reduce the number of people experiencing mental ill health and relieve pressure on the mental health system, raise the rate. The welfare system kills people. More than 3 million people, that's more than 1 in 10 of us, are living in poverty. If you want to leave nobody behind, poverty is a political choice. Don't make it yours. Raise the rate. Sorry, I just have been providing a lot of help to people lately.
Thank you, Ms O'Connell. Thank you, and I really thank you for your passion and your advocacy and your work for people who are really doing it tough. Okay. Look, I'll start. You've all, as Ms O'Connell just very passionately said, you're all advocating to raise the rate. There are different views as to how much it should be raised by, and then there are people who basically say if you raise it by too much, you're going to disincentivise people to be looking for work. So I'll start with the first part of that in terms of we know, so much evidence has been put toward us of the need to raise the rate. How should we be deciding how much to raise it by?
Can we just start by pointing out that in 2020, people who had previously been living on payments long term felt very guilty, and they felt that it was the best year of their life, unlike most people who had suffered a lot in 2020, because they felt better equipped than ever to look for and secure work and to keep it. That's because they had enough energy and good enough health to do so, and no mutual obligations. And I think it's very important to look always to the piece of ACOS research from that year that showed when people had payments at the Henderson poverty line, a third of people were regularly skipping meals and 42% were skipping healthcare. So there's no real excuse. It's morally repugnant to decide that people have to live in poverty or else they won't work, but we've also seen that the stick approach does not help anyone, and that giving people support does enable them, and people do seek work.
Thank you.
To note too that people on pensions didn't get the coronavirus supplement.
Yes, we
stayed
on
under
the poverty line.
So would you like to respond in terms of, how should we determine how much the rate should be raised by?
It's a very difficult question for a non-economist. I think the thing to do is draw in the expertise that's available on how much it should be raised by. I mean, we can't hold a finger to the wind and say, this much. We do in our submission point to work that's been done by ANU about how with what they call modest treatment of taxation, if you want to put it that way, on capital gains, on superannuation, on some other things, how much across low, medium and high options for raising the rate could be funded by the government. We would go for the high rise, which is, sorry, I need my glasses for this, which is, raising JobSeeker by $436 per fortnight. The disability support and carer payments by $200. We would want more than that, but that's the modelling. Parenting payments would rise to the equivalent of the rise in the JobSeeker. And I mean, one of the reasons we've turned to this work is that it is set against a background where the authors acknowledge the reluctance of governments over time to do anything really about social security payments, and especially not to use taxes to cover the necessary rates. So that's a start. ACOS has got its own approach to this, but how much it has to rise, if you're asking us, we don't know.
Okay. Yeah. That's more than what it is at the moment. Yes. Yeah. Ms. Wren, do you have a view about how much? And how should it be determined?
Sure. Obviously, there's a number of ways, and initially, we don't have an agreed definition in Australia of the poverty line. That would be a good step forward and has been recommended by many, because unless we have that agreed definition, it's hard to then start to move. We think there's a good opportunity to just simply take the 50% of median household income rather than do a big inquiry. The standard one that's used by the OECD at the kind of modest end, 50%, not 60%, that's used mostly in Australia by UNSW, ACOS, Poverty and Inequality Partnership. It's used by the HILDA study, which is funded by DSS. So if we use that definition rather than spend a lot of time, we'd say go for that. And then we would definitely want payments to be at that level. Initially, I think a JobSeeker could easily be moved, and the related payments, because that's the important thing. JobSeeker is a bit like the minimum wage, in the welfare system, because when job seeker goes up, it affects a whole lot of other payments. So it affects parenting payments, payments for students. That's why it's so important. So at the moment, there's about 1.4 million Australians who get those payments. So an increase has a big impact in terms of poverty as well. So we would say at least to the pension rate would be a good start. And I note the government has an economic inclusion advisory panel recently established. We strongly believe people with lived experience need to be included on that, but that is has a good selection of academics and others as well that could be part of recommending this approach. So yeah, that would be where we'd start. But job seeker is absolutely the most effective way to reduce poverty in Australia. Full stop. Increasing job seeker and related payments. So again, it answers the question. This is not a problem with a solution we don't have.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Anti-Poverty Centre, I mean, you say in your submission that all existing poverty measures are flawed, so...
Yeah. Yeah, so I think in determining where it needs to be, the reason that we support the Henderson Poverty Line is because we saw that in response to a societal crisis, which was COVID, that it worked effectively. It wasn't perfect, and it's by no means, you know, a cure-all. However, we do know that from studies at the time, one led by Dr. Elise Klein, who you'll be hearing from this afternoon, pointed out that, you know, time use under COVID and the payments were effective. People were more fully equipped to look for work, to study, to take care of themselves and others in the community as well. And given that people on payments generally are, if they're not with support services, are caring for one another. And that's a fundamental thing that we do in our work, is caring for a lot of people, particularly when it comes to mental health supports as well, because again, the social wage, I should say, when it comes to healthcare is just, it's degrading, and we're seeing that rapidly degrade as it has done over the past 2 decades. We're seeing it without access to, you know, GPs, affordable healthcare. We're seeing it without access to mental health. We're seeing it without access to a variety of other things. So if we're to go round back to what we should be looking at in terms of the rate, we need to, and that's why we advocate for the Henderson Poverty Line, is to consider that the social wage is essentially almost dead in Australia, and we cannot wait to restore it to help people. And yeah, that's why we support the Henderson Poverty Line. And
what do you mean by saying the social wage is almost dead?
Well, seeing a GP is becoming unaffordable, or the GPs that you do see, speaking from experience, not that they're bad doctors, but they're overburdened by the amount of people that rely on them. You know, when it comes to mental health, it's just not possible. Waiting lists for free under the GPs, you know, very long, yeah, and it's not free as it is. So, yeah.
Schools have fees now.
Yeah, public education is eroding while we're seeing private education record sky-high profits. And then we're also seeing, you know, other so-called social supports like employment services, which are recording profits, which is just, you know, antithetical for the purpose of, you know, frontline social welfare programs. So we really need to, and that's why we advocate for a new poverty line that's fully equipped for the end of the social wage as we see it, in order to create a fundamental baseline for where we can begin to work to restore a new social wage that actually protects people, because it's eroded, it's almost eroded.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of that mechanism that we're proposing, there's 2 components to it. There's expertise in the process for developing a poverty line, but then there's also the way that we would like to see a poverty line operate, which, you know, in the future that we would like to see, we would see a return to a really substantive social wage. And of course, if that happens, people will not need as much cash in their pocket, because everyone in the country who wants it would be able to live in public housing if that's what they preferred. People would be able to send their kids to school for free and access a whole range of essential things without having to pay much or any money at all. So that's the kind of intention, to come up with a sophisticated measure of poverty that responds to other changes in other government policy areas, and to therefore push for changes in those areas to see things like housing decommodified. That's one example. In terms of getting there, we think one of the biggest problems with existing poverty measures, there's lots of problems, but you know, it's all well and good for a whole bunch of people with well-paid jobs to say the median poverty line is a good one to start, but it's not if you have to live on it. Like, that's fine to say if you don't have to live on it, and that's the only people who say it. We know that one of the problems with even what are called basket of goods approaches to developing poverty lines is that they start from a very deficit-based perspective. And the idea, again, you will have people who get paid a lot of money to sit down and go, what is the barest minimum we can give a person to just scrape by in survival? And they always fail to factor in the realities of life. There has been some recent work done. I will not mention the university because I'm not going to say anything pleasant about it, but in the last few years, someone did a piece of work, or a group did a piece of work that said, oh, well, here's the basics if we do a basket of goods. Well, it didn't account for the fact that you need to buy a fridge, you get kicked out of your private rental regularly and that costs money. None of that was factored in. It was like, here's the minimum you could spend on groceries if you had a basic diet. And so we need to have people who are experts. People who are experts are people who have to live on low incomes, leading and informing these processes at the top level and being centred with the support of people like economists to engage with that process, but not to be top down and in charge of it.
Thank you.
Senator, I was just going to speak to the second part of the question,
Yes.
Around the disincentive to work. I think that's always been an argument about why we shouldn't have a higher rate, but the reality is the rate of job seeker, even with the $25 a week increase that we saw in 2021 after the coronavirus supplement was abolished, it's still only 42% of the minimum wage. So in terms of people not gaining an incentive to take a job, it's so far below historically where it was as well, that there is no issue there. What we're seeing as well is that employers continue to advocate for an increase in job seeker. At the Job Summit, we had the Business Council of Australia joining again with the ACTU and ACOS to say the rate should be raised, because just from a self-interest point of view, they can see that people who have not got enough money to feed themselves well, to buy the medications they need, to put petrol in their car, to go to a job interview, are not actually going to be able to take up job opportunities that may exist. So that's where we see. And the other thing we did see, and I don't know if you'll have any evidence from Professor Borland, Jeff Borland, but he's on the Economic Inclusion Advisory Panel. He did some work actually in the pandemic on whether or not that doubling of payments was a disincentive, and he concluded it was not. And he's one of our eminent labour market economists. So I think we can just dismiss that argument. What we also need to recognise is that many people who are reliant on job seeker are not what you would typically call unemployed. Many of them, 40%, have a disability or an incapacity to work. I call it a waiting room for the age pension. The majority are over 45. They can't get disability support pension because you need legal representation in this country now to get it. It's so tough. And then we also know there's 85,000 single parent family mothers, mainly, who are on job seeker, who have many other conflicting responsibilities. So there is a large proportion of people who are receiving those payments who have other issues around either employers who have discrimination against them and don't want to hire them, or simply have barriers to getting work. So that's where I'd leave it.
Thank you. Just one more thing on that as well is that 1 in 5 people on the job seeker payment has a job, a paid job. Like, people are struggling to survive having a paid job, living in poverty, because the wages aren't enough. And so it's very simple. People don't not want to work. They have those structural barriers to employment, and lots of them already have paid work as well.
Thank you. I just wanted to note that we've got Mr. Jonathan Davis, one of the ACT MLAs, in the audience with us today, who would like to take some photos. So are you all happy to have photos taken? Yeah. Just note, Mr. Davis, yes, not allowed to take photos of our papers here, of my papers here. Thank you. I'm going to throw very soon to Senator Smith, who's got some questions, but I did have one last question to Ms O'Connell or Mr Coonan. You, in your submission, you talk about Commonwealth rent assistance and why you think an increase in income support is a better way to go rather than increasing Commonwealth rent assistance. Could you talk through that for us, please?
Sure. Yes, I do want to talk to that. Rent assistance is a deeply problematic payment. I'm one of the few people who's fortunate to receive it, but lots of people, and particularly people on job seeker and youth allowance, the lowest payments cannot get it. And one of the barriers to accessing rent assistance is poverty, because you cannot get into a rental when you're living on those payments. Rent assistance is not much. It doesn't go anywhere near enough. $70 a week hopefully doesn't surprise anyone. That's not really enough to cover any meaningful proportion of rent these days. And doubling it is not going to improve that very much either. But it is more the fact that it excludes so many people. Raising the base rate of income support immediately provides relief without administrative burden to every single person who relies on income support. Rent assistance, even by expanding eligibility, still does have that administrative burden. And not only that, actually, I think this happened to Jay a few months ago, you get cut off because Centrelink stuffs up the paperwork, right? Like, Centrelink is understaffed, the paperwork is complicated, mistakes happen and people lose access to it or never get access to it in the first place for these reasons. Sometimes payment isn't the paperwork isn't processed correctly, and people then incur a Centrelink so-called debt, which is a result of an administrative error, and then people end up obviously in severe distress because of that. So it's deeply inadequate, and increasing it by anything other than, I don't know, quadrupling it and tying it to geographic rent, like rents on geographic basis, would not bring it anywhere to being meaningful. But it's the fact that it excludes so many people. And we do have, I think, in the documents we've tabled this morning, which actually I don't think we did at the beginning, we did send through some documents to the Secretariat to table. And I believe in there we've got a story from someone called Karen who lost her home because job seeker's so low. An older woman who, you know, as with the case that we always hear, you know, out of the workforce, raising children, not a high overall lifelong earnings, ending up on job seeker in middle age, losing her home. And then because she had to sell her home because she couldn't afford to pay the very modest mortgage on it, was excluded from job seeker payments until that money was gone. And then, of course, having run down her savings, became reliant on the government again and probably qualified for rent assistance at that point. So we don't think people should have to become homeless to qualify for rent assistance, but that's just some, I think, of the things. Did I miss anything there?
So I suppose that, yeah, the issue being with Commonwealth rent assistance and why we advocate for a raise to the base payment instead is just, you know, all payments just need to be lifted, regardless of what it is or who it's for. It just needs to be lifted. The additional bureaucracy that is in the way of receiving Commonwealth rent assistance is itself a barrier and a disincentive towards claiming that allowance. So, for example, a person may not be on a lease and they'll be sharing a house, and if they're not on a lease, they're not able to qualify for a rent certificate, so therefore they don't qualify for Commonwealth rent assistance. Even though, like, recently, my own personal experience, I am on a lease. I share a house with a good friend of mine, and I submitted that lease to Centrelink, which by its own guidelines is a correct documentation. However, they cut my rent assistance, and it took me a few weeks of waiting on the very long wait list or call lists, and speaking to 3 or 4 different people in order to kind of push through to get them to recognise it. And it took me, saying that I was going to make a complaint and had intentions of going to the AET if they weren't to correct it. And then instantly I was put on hold, and that person returned and said, "Oh no, your paperwork is correct, no worries, we'll reinstate it." And it also happened to, the person that I share with, and it took him far longer with the same documentation that I pointed him towards, the same methods, and he was had to be back paid because of how long he had not been in receipt of Commonwealth rent assistance. So expanding its eligibility is one way to do it, but that's why we think, well, steer clear of that bureaucracy and afford more people the right to be able to feed themselves and house themselves by just installing that right into the base rate of payments.
I forgot the biggest problem with the payment, which is that it goes straight to landlords. And so what that means is you can't access it unless your rent is high enough And you also can't access it as soon as you have rent to pay. It does not apply to the first proportion of your rent, right? There's a threshold. Once you're over that threshold, it does not cover every dollar over that threshold, even up to the cap. So you're falling behind even when you're receiving it. You cannot get that money unless your rent goes up if you're not above the maximum. So if you get a higher payment, you can make judgments about your life and where you can save money and where you can't. The other problem, of course, is that it will make no difference to any person living in community housing which is basically getting, back channel funding from government, because the government doesn't want to fund community housing. Instead, they have this thing called rent assistance. 100% of that goes straight to the provider. So we've made very clear that community housing providers need to be funded and that people who live in community housing need to have money to live their life. Rent assistance doesn't do either of those things, really.
Thank you. Ms Elderton. Quickly.
Yes, I actually agree with everything that's been said, but if the government won't raise the base rate, rent assistance has to be increased now.
Thank you. Senator Smith.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for attending today and for your evidence. I wanted to start with you, Ms O'Connell. You made reference in your opening statement to mutual obligations. I appreciate sort of the evidence you've given on the rate of job seeker, but I was just hoping you could unpack your concerns around the mutual obligation scheme a bit more and why you think it's so problematic.
Yeah, there are two. Thank you for the question. There are two big issues. One is that if you have mutual obligations, you take longer to find a job. So there was a fantastic study that came out in 2021. It was a long-term study. I think it was 19 years, if I recall correctly, comparing long-term unemployed people with other long-term unemployed people. One cohort had mutual obligations and the other didn't. The cohort with mutual obligations took longer to get a job. The jobs they got were lower paid and did not last as long. They ended up back in the social security system faster if they got out of it at all. So first and foremost, aside from anything else, they're stupid. So they don't work. Second to that, at the moment, with the way they are structured, is that the whole system is geared to almost enable and encourage abuse. People are, we're struggling to live on these payments, and I'm so lucky I don't have mutual obligations anymore because I'm on the disability support pension. But when you make a mistake, or the job agency makes a mistake, or the computer system makes a mistake, your payment doesn't arrive. You can't eat, you can't pay your bills, you can't pay your rent. That is too great a threat. What people want is support. So they want actual help with things they need. People know what they need. We are experts in our own lives. So, for example, when I went to Serena Russo and they told me that they didn't know what human rights were, which was my previous job, I knew that I didn't need their help. People who know that they want support with a particular thing want to be able to go and get it. And one of the things we hear from a lot of folks we work with is that, for example, they would like help with writing their resume. Now, that is something job agencies are supposed to do, but people who see job agencies don't get help, and their resumes are worse after they get that so-called help. So they're harming people, they make it harder to get a job, and they don't offer what people actually do want. They're not supportive.
Yeah, so I'd just also like to, add on to that is that, again, mutual obligations have been a construction of, the past 3 decades, and were, essentially built for a different, economic system that we had through the 80s, 90s and 2000s, and also for a completely different cohort that was, on working age payments. So now, as we've, from basic social security data, we know that the majority, as it's been said on the panel today, that 40% are disabled, more likely to be single parents, carers, people already working. That's obviously a stark difference to what it was in the early 90s, particularly after the recession then, when it was mainly males with the ability to work and limited disabilities. So the mutual obligation systems are totally ill-equipped and serve absolutely no purpose for the cohort that rely on social security payments today. So basically what we have now is a system of punishment rather than support. And, as somebody who has mutual obligations at the moment, Being in Workforce Australia, I've had 4 different consultants since, July of this year, and most of them have told me that it's only a short-term job for them. So the people who are employed aren't even qualified to be able to provide that support, and the people who are going in there, they need actual social supports. They need, whether it's drug and alcohol, whether it's housing, whether it's even finding access to a community pantry. But these services don't do that. They're based on a marketised system of outcome payments based on employment that people generally find themselves if they're lucky enough to find employment. So that is why we and many others, including the Australian Unemployed Workers Union, advocate for the end of mutual obligations. And what we need to see is a far better social safety net that actually supports people rather than just punishing them.
And work for the dole in particular is undermining the labour market, because those should be real jobs. Those jobs should exist, and they're retail jobs often. And at the moment, people are doing free labour, and organisations are being paid to get free labour.
And is it your evidence that there's nothing we can do to really fix the mutual obligation scheme, that you just don't want to see it at all? Or do you think there are things that government could do to reform or improve that scheme to make it work better for those seeking to get back into the workforce and get into work?
Well, when it comes to reform, I find that a difficult word, because it's like, well, what we have now it just simply doesn't work. So I don't know what point there is in reforming something that has just proven to fundamentally be a failure and a social harm. So that's why we go, well, end the mutual obligation system as it is, and then send to the people who are relying on incomes or social security payments, and work with them, find out what they want and what they need in order to be able to improve their lives. And from somebody who's been doing this for 3 years now and has been on and off payments quite a while, that is a higher payment. I'm lucky enough to be able to have worked in hospitality. Some people don't have that. So it's like, well, what we need to do is just give the people who cannot get off these payments for no fault of their own, and provide them with the supports by what they ask. And that's obviously going to vary based on completely different geographical locations. People, in the Northern Territory are going to need fundamentally far different supports than they do in, North or Northwestern Tasmania. So that's what we need to do, is just centre the people who are on those payments, find out what they need, and then build a better, far supportive system based off of geographical instances of poverty.
But if it's compulsory, it will never work, because you cannot have trust in a system that can leave you starving and unable to pay your rent. And to get the support that people want, they need to be able to trust the people providing them that support, and trust that they're not going to wake up on payday with nothing in their bank account. And even if people are fulfilling all of the requirements, mistakes are happening with these systems. And even when you have done everything you're supposed to, nothing comes, you get cut off. So that's why compulsory systems will not work.
And are you both, I'm sure you are, but participating in Mr Hill's inquiry?
Yes, absolutely. And we've been doing the work Jay just talked about. We've actually gone and run workshops with folks, talking to them about what they want, what would work in their community, and we've got a whole proposal ready to go for that. So hopefully the committee will take it seriously.
Senator Smith,
I appreciate there's 2 things running concurrently, but that one is very interesting to...
Senator Smith, Ms Wren wanted to respond to your question as well.
I just wanted to, I've had some experience, particularly in the past, with a scheme called JET, which was Jobs, Education and Training. It was introduced quite a long time ago, and that was to support single parents get back to work. And as we know, single parents have the highest poverty rates, and their children have the highest poverty rates still in Australia. And that was a voluntary scheme. It was very effective. It supported those mainly mothers to get better jobs, because it supported them to study for higher level roles where they can then actually support their families out of poverty. That scheme sadly was abolished, I think probably by the Howard government. We've now got this ridiculous scheme called Parents Next, which I did mention again, that seems to only be about punishing. And we have so many shocking stories, particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander single mums who are affected by that. And I would just strongly urge that Parents Next be abolished. We also know the women mainly on parenting payments single who have very young children, have the highest rate of earnings of anyone in the income support system. Around 30% are already working, and they don't actually mostly have mutual obligations. So again, that's a bit more evidence that we don't need to use the stick. We need more help. Thanks.
Thanks, Ms. Wren. My next question was actually to you anyway, so we'll stay here. You mentioned in your evidence, you spoke about, you know, a sign of the success or value of a society. I can't remember the exact word you used, was how it treats its children. And I'm just interested if you have a perspective on the role of early learning and care in breaking cycles of poverty, addressing disadvantage, and where that sort of access piece might sit.
Sure, thanks very much. Yeah, it's actually Nelson Mandela I'm quoting about the society.
I absolutely butchered Mr. Mandela's quote.
I was trying to lift us up on this day. Yeah, it's about our soul. How do we treat our children reflects our soul. I love that quote. I think early years is very important, but you can't, it doesn't matter how great your early years program is, if parents are having to send their kids to early years with hungry tummies, where the family is worried about becoming homeless because their rent are so high they can't afford them. We know from Food Bank Australia's report last year in Anti-Poverty Week, 1.3 million children lived in a household that was hungry in Australia. We're one of the richest countries in the world. If we don't address the income, we can't do anything else. Early years can't fix that. The best parenting program in the world can't fix those core basic things that every child needs. And we know that the mothers and fathers in those very poor families are incredibly stressed, trying to do the best they can. That stress translates. Professor Sharon Bassel has done some incredible research talking to children and parents who are on the ground. And it's heartbreaking. The kids know. They stop giving the parents birthday party invitations, excursion notes for school. They know the parents can't afford to do that. So it's absolutely something we have to tackle. And we know, again, from the research, income makes a difference. The money is spent on the children. We saw that with the coronavirus supplement, and we've seen that with heaps of other evidence.
Thank you, Ms. Wren. Chair, I've just got one more question for Carers Australia. We're okay for time?
Yep, all good.
I just was interested in your perspective, and correct me if this isn't something you're working on, but I get a lot of informal feedback from grandparents who are caring for grandchildren and the impact on those grandparents and their income and I guess our economy and our community relies a lot on unpaid grandparent care. So I was just wondering if Carers Australia had a perspective on that, which might be relevant to our inquiry.
So the current definition of caring falls under the Commonwealth Carer Recognition Act, which specifies some of the conditions of the person being cared for. So it's not just children, but it could be children with a disability or children with a mental illness or so on. So there are specific definitions. It doesn't include sort of kinship care, although some of the state carer recognition acts do include kinship care. So I would say absolutely that grandparents who are caring for grandchildren will have very serious financial burdens as part of that caring process, but that doesn't fall under carer as sort of guides our work because of that Recognition Act.
No, I understood. I thought that might be the case, but I thought it was worth placing the question. Yeah.
Just if I could just say one thing, we've been talking about the inadequacy of the sort of income support systems. I just wanted to say something about the compounding impact in respect to carers. So carers, by their nature, have put aside their own needs for the interests of the person for whom they're caring, and sometimes that makes them quite invisible, including invisible to themselves and their own needs and their own health needs and so on. And so there's this compounding impact where the needs of the person they're caring for requires them to incur extra expenses that need to be met often by these carer payments. So these are transport needs to medical appointments, they're gap payments, pharmaceuticals and so on that otherwise couldn't be met unless it was from their support payment. I just want to make that point. And the result of that is that there's very little left over. Often there are meals missed, bills are unpaid, and often, in fact, there's overwhelming evidence about the extent to which carers have poorer health outcomes, mental health outcomes, they're socially isolated and so on. I just want to make that point. Thank you.
And I think a third of carers are also disabled. Is that about right?
That's correct.
Bruce? Yeah.
Yes, and thank you, Ms Brooke and Ms Elderton, for your submission that outlines those cascading effects on carers. I thought it was very sobering.
Just to expand on older people who are carers, caring, for example, for somebody on a disability support pension who can't get by on that pension unless their carers regularly supply them with extra money. The thing that grandparent carers, people with disability, etc., fear most is dying, is getting too old to be employed. And it's just a constant worry. If I go, what on earth is going to happen to them? And again, that worry would be less if the base rates of the pensions, of the income support payments were lifted.
That real sense that our so-called safety net is not safe.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Could I just finish with ask you all what a couple of you in your submissions talk about legislation you would like to see, but just sort of talk through what legislative changes would you like to see?
Shall I go first?
Yes.
We at Anti-Poverty Week have looked to the New Zealand model. The previous Prime Minister there made a huge commitment to halve child poverty by 2030 when she was in opposition. And she introduced legislation within 100 days of her election. She was also the Minister for Poverty Reduction, Child Poverty Reduction. We've looked at what has been achieved through that model, and a lot has been achieved for children, but also for people in poverty who don't have children. So we think that model should be adopted. We think legislation to committing to halve child poverty means that there is, with actions and measurable targets that need to be reported on by the Parliament, would be a very positive way to go. It's independent, and as we see in New Zealand, the fact that Prime Minister has now gone is irrelevant. Those commitments remain and the Parliament is held accountable.
Before going on to the other two organisations, what have been the key measures that they've introduced in New Zealand?
They did 3 increases to the base rate of payments. So again, speaking to our increase in JobSeeker, they did some specific increases around family payments equivalent, and again, we've called for that and a review of our family payment system. They've also looked at reviewing and improving child support, which is another critical piece to the child poverty reduction that we need to address. We've got at least $2 billion in unpaid child support owed to children here in Australia. So they've also worked in the housing space. So there's been a range of measures, and we've got a paper it's referred to. There's a link in our submission to our paper on what New Zealand's achieved. Of course, there's lots more to do there, but they did have achieved quite a lot. So we would definitely advocate for that. Right. And I just wanted to quickly say we really welcome this inquiry, but we also are acutely aware there was a significant inquiry into the adequacy of Newstart in the previous Parliament. It had 471 submissions, hundreds of hours of testimony. And
you want to see action.
Well, exactly.
Yes.
And sadly, that is one of 13 parliamentary inquiries that were never responded to by the due date in the previous parliament. So I know this is beyond your control, but I guess I'm appealing more to the parliament, please, and to the government of the day to please respond in a timely manner to this report. And absolutely, we need to act, not just study.
Thanks, Ms Wren. So,
yeah, well, I think we obviously, as we've said ad nauseum today, is to obviously just increase the base rates of payment. I think the time for targeted kind of, action or, targeted measures is over. We just really need to have a fundamental lift to bring everyone up. But I suppose what is the other thing that is upcoming, which is the Economic Inclusion Committee, and we know that there's going to be legislation around that towards the end of this year. What we need to see is, within that structure, more power to centering people who are in poverty or on low incomes to actually have a voice and say in what those policy measures and decision making actually is. So it's all well and good that we want to have representation through this committee, but it actually needs to centre the voices and cede that ground to people who are living in poverty. Yeah.
And to be clear, we don't want legislation for a body that doesn't have power itself. So we want to see a body that has people who are in these systems, and there are many ways in which we're economically excluded, and we have attached a letter to this submission that lists some of the groups that we would suggest be included in any form of body, but that it should not be an advisory body, that there needs to be power put in the hands of people who aren't government, because our lives should not be subject to the whims of politicians who use us as political footballs.
Thank you. Thanks, Ms O'Connell. Carers Australia, you have legislative asks?
What everybody else has just said, but also in our submission we've identified some changes that could be made by the next budget. One of those changes is that recently legislation's been introduced so that people over the age of 65 on pensions, including the carer payment, can earn an extra $300 a fortnight before the taper rate kicks in. We can't see why it should only be people on those pensions over the age of 65. There's just no logic, as far as we're concerned, to that.
Yeah, so everybody should be able to access that ability to earn more.
Yeah. We're still waiting to see what comes out of strengthening the Strengthening Medicare Task Force. But certainly one thing we hope they're looking at is the adequacy of the Medicare safety net. And then there are some other things that actually don't require legislation, and we've mentioned the young carer bursary. They're only 1,000. Many more bursaries are needed for young carers. Yeah.
We forgot to also mention a permanent end to dangerous debt collection practices. We've got obviously some detailed proposals in there, but the debt collection regime in this country needs to be transformed into a payment accuracy model, where we're actually looking to make sure that people got the right amount of payment and that no one is forced to repay money until they have a livable income.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for your testimony today, for your submissions and for your powerful advocacy on behalf of people who are living in poverty. Thank you. I don't think any of you took questions on notice, but if there was further information that you suddenly think you should have said, if you could get that to us by the 17th of March, that would be valuable.
Those documents come through that I sent this morning?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
And we're going to be reporting to the Senate on the 31st of October, so we've got a bit of a way to go yet. Thank you. Thanks very much. So I now welcome via video conference and in person representatives from Economic Justice Australia. Well, thank you. So look, I'm Senator Janet Rice, the chair of the committee, and I've got joining me via video conference Senators Marielle Smith and Senator Slade Brockman. I think we've got Senator Tammy Terrell also joining us on the teleconference. So,
Pratt here on the teleconference.
and Senator Pratt on the teleconference. So have we got Senator Tyrrell as well? Doesn't sound like it. Okay, thank you. So, look, thank you for appearing before the committee today. So for the Hansard record, would you each please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today, and we'll start with Ms Sivasamy in the room.
Hello, my name is Kavita Sivasamy. I am here as a representative from Economic Justice Australia, and I work at Canberra Community Law, which is a member centre.
Thank you.
Sarah Saka. I'm a law officer at Economic Justice Australia.
Thank you, Ms Sasha.
And I'm Abby Cohn. I'm here as a representative for EJA, and I work as a solicitor at the Member Centre of Townsville Community Law.
Thank you, Ms Cohn. So I now invite you to make an opening statement, and then we will ask you some questions.
Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee as representatives of Economic Justice Australia and member centres Canberra Community Law and Townsville Community Law. I am here as Kavita Sivasamy, a solicitor from Canberra Community Law, and I will start by setting the scene with one of our case studies. Then Sarah will summarise some of our key policy asks, and Abby will provide stories to illustrate these from her casework. Anne's job seeker payment was automatically suspended because she was ill and unable to attend a job interview. She called up her employment services provider to explain, but they refused to lift her suspension or accept her medical certificate for non-attendance. Anne advised that she desperately needed to have her suspension lifted as it was the end of her payment fortnight and she had no money left for food or other essentials. So she decided to go by train to her employment services office to sort it out. She didn't have any money to top up her transport card, but was desperate, so decided to catch the train anyway. Anne was apprehended at the train station and issued with a fine for over $400. Upon arrival at the employment service, they initially refused to see her and told her to come back the next day. Anne knew that if she left, she risked getting another fine and she wouldn't be able to buy any food until her payments were reinstated. With the help of one of our member centre's lawyers, Anne's suspension was lifted that afternoon. However, the money was not credited to her account in time for her to add credit to her transport card, and she received a further $200 fine on the way home. Anne now had a $600 debt with no savings to draw from, so she decided to cut back from 2 meals a day to just 1 meal a day for the next few months in order to pay it off. A fair and accessible social security system is fundamental to addressing poverty. It provides a safety net to keep a person clothed, housed and fed, as well as the stability to enable them to plan for the future, raise their family and engage in their community. We have provided a submission with recommendations for reform of the social security system. Our submission and our evidence today are informed by the work of EJA's membership, comprised of community legal centres that provide specialist social security advice. Urgent action is needed to substantially raise social security income support rates, particularly in light of the soaring costs of living. The temporary coronavirus supplement provided during the peak of COVID-19 indicates that it is simple to increase social security payment rates. All that is required is a political will to do so.
Thank you, Ms Sivasamy.
I will now pass on to Sarah from EJA, my colleague.
Thank you. So there are holes in our social safety net that lead to some of the most vulnerable members of our community being excluded from receiving any income support whatsoever. Legislative and systemic exclusions can arbitrarily prevent people from accessing payments that are necessary for their survival. The social security system without first addressing these inequities. I'd like to draw the committee's attention to some of our key recommendations in this regard. The first is that arbitrary waiting periods must be abolished. The date of certain income support payments for those who are eligible may be delayed due to waiting periods. We particularly highlight the newly arrived waiting period, which generally applies to new arrivals who must wait 4 years before they are able to access Social Security working age payments. This fuels poverty and homelessness. It leads to pressures on charities and community organisations, and it exposes new migrants to workforce exploitation. Secondly, long-stay visa holders should be provided with access to special benefit. There are cohorts of people living in Australia on long-stay work or student visas who can't qualify for income support. This includes special benefit, which is designed to be a payment of last resort. During the COVID-19 lockdowns, many international student and migrant workers had no choice but to leave Australia or depend on charitable support due to this exclusion. Thirdly, barriers to accessing the disability support pension must be removed. The current legislative framework and system for assessing eligibility for disability support pension is not fit for purpose. Many people with disability in Australia are effectively consigned to job seeker indefinitely and struggle to comply with mutual obligations. The debt waiver provisions need to be updated. Current debt waiver provisions do not reflect the reality that domestic violence victims may accrue social security debt as a direct result of the actions of their abuser. The legislation is out of line with community expectations and leads to further victimisation for those caught by the provisions. I will now pass on to Abby, who has some further examples and cases.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. So for the sake of brevity, I will just speak to one case, but I am happy to provide further examples if it would assist the committee. I want to deal briefly with the complexities of exemptions from the non-resident waiting period. So I assisted a 70-year-old woman who had come here from Malaysia. She had a primary school education and basic English skills. She was being supported by her son and his family, who had applied for a parent visa in 2018. However, there had been significant delay from Centrelink in relation to approving an assurance, what's called an assurance of support, and that visa was only granted at the end of 2019. So this effectively meant that instead of the 2-year waiting period, she was then subject to a 4-year waiting period. She was living and supported by her son for 2.5 years, as well as working as a cashier. However, during the COVID-19 crisis, she had to stop that work and she found work as a cleaner. Unfortunately, given her age and her declining physical health, she suffered a few injuries at work and a few falls and had to stop that work as well. Her son also suffered an injury at work and was made redundant towards the end of 2022. And her daughter-in-law had medical complications and was also unable to work. So we ended up with a family of 6 people who were all living in the one house with no income. This is when Lee came to us, and we assisted her with a review to the tribunal that found that she was in fact able to take special benefit from her application date in July, after she had been told by Centrelink that she couldn't because of the 4-year waiting period. But this meant that there were 4 months where that family had no access to income of any kind. Lee was also hoping to move out into public housing because the relationship with her family had broken down by this point. But public housing had told her that until she was receiving any sort of benefit, she would not be able to get into public housing at all. This was a complex case because there were issues around the temporality of the change. So whether the son's injury was the change, whether it was his redundancy, at what point that change had occurred. And that is important because of the complexities of the law, which says that the change has to occur after the arrival in Australia. There were also issues around a compensation payment that had been paid to her daughter-in-law and whether that meant that she could not be considered to be in severe financial hardship for those purposes. So legislative and administrative reform will only be effective if Services Australia's resourcing priorities are refocused. And that's a refocusing away from a culture of compliance to a culture of focusing on measures to enhance equitable access to entitlement and rights. Investment is particularly needed to improve vulnerable cohorts' access to locally based Services Australia social workers and specialist support staff. Internal review processes also need to be better resourced to address systemic barriers to appealing adverse decisions. We emphasise the importance of ensuring access to justice for those subject to unfair or inaccurate social security decisions. The social security system and legal framework can be difficult, if not impossible, for individuals to navigate without specialist assistance, and this is especially true for vulnerable people. I speak as a solicitor from a member centre in a generalist service where almost 25% of our casework is generally legal representation for social security matters. We do not have a specialist social security lawyer, and the work that we do in this space is in addition to the daily cases that we deal with in all other areas. Social security legal assistance services must be adequately funded to address the high levels of unmet need in the community. And this is including people in remote and very remote communities. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms Cohn, for that, and thank you all of you, and thank you for the work that you're doing to be supporting people who are struggling so much. And thank you for your focus on people who aren't receiving any social security, any income support at all. I mean, a lot of this, the focus of this inquiry has been on people who at least are receiving something. But yes, just the reality that there are many people in our community who are not receiving income support. But could you give us a bit of a sense of, you talk about the need for people who are not covered. So what numbers of people are we talking about in Australia who are trying to live on zero income?
Well, Chair, if I may, there is a newly arrived resident waiting period that is applied to most social security benefits, including the special benefit, which is generally accessed in instances of financial hardship when people aren't eligible for other benefits. But that is quite difficult to demonstrate, and we do come across that very often. And I think it's the newly arrived resident waiting period, and my colleagues can elaborate, is particularly concerning because these are people who are often have been granted permanent residency, but regardless of that, I mean, our human rights obligations extend to people who reside in Australia regardless of their residency status. But there are people who have been granted permanent residency who aren't able to access any benefits and special benefits. And there are exceptions to qualifying for, special benefit. Like if you can demonstrate a substantial change of circumstances since your arrival for reasons beyond your control, you can access that special benefits. But in practice, it's quite hard. And I mean, I would probably like to draw on a case study of someone who I came across, and we come across these people very often. And just to explain as well the implications that it has for her and the implications that it could have for her. So this person's name was Priya. In my line of work, I mainly assist people with public housing law, but that's quite often intertwined with social security issues as well, because a lot of people who do seek our support in public housing are often, their only source of income is Centrelink benefits. So Priya was living at a women's refuge in Tura with two of her children. She actually has 3 children, but Tura could only accommodate 2 children, so one of her daughters had to actually go and live by herself at a very young age in Sydney. Priya had actually arrived in Australia a long time ago, and she was with her partner and she had 2 of her children here. It was a long road to be granted permanent residency, and she was on visa subclasses that disabled her from accessing any special benefits at all, which we also discussed in the submissions. So when she was what happened is there was a lot of family violence. Her partner actually locked her up in a room in the house, and she attempted self-harm many times, and she was lucky enough with support services, to escape that violent relationship. But she had been granted her PR, and her children had as well, after a long battle, but she wasn't eligible for social security benefits. And in someone in her situation, even if we were to demonstrate that they should be able to access social security, special benefits, that process can take a really long time, which can really entrench a lot of poverty that people are already living in. In her instance, she had a lot of mental health issues, understandably as a result of the domestic violence, and she wasn't eligible for social security benefits, so she had to work and she had to live away from one of her daughters. And, you know, the last thing you can afford in that situation is seeing a psychologist or psychiatrist to see if you might be eligible for a disability support pension. So she was working despite all her concerns, and she was only able to cope with part-time work, you know, because her trauma and mental health barriers prevented her from taking on more work, and also her sole parenting responsibilities. She couldn't, so I think the complication there is, I mean, it's really sad as well. In the ACT, even seeing, at least in the ACT, even seeing a GP, it's hard to see a bulk bill GP. So all her money just went straight to meeting day-to-day expenses. And in that situation, she didn't have the money to access the treatment that she required, including mental health support. A lot of people in her, I mean, her situation is horrible, but it actually could be worse. And we see that all the time in our work. I mean, she was somehow, and I always admire our clients for their courage and their resilience, but she was somehow able to work. But a lot of people in her situation are not able to work, and they do not receive an income. And when someone doesn't receive an income, at least from a public housing point of view, it can be difficult to get an application accepted, or at least accepted and placed on priority, because with no income, it's hard to demonstrate your ability to sustain a tenancy. And so someone in her position could also have that barrier to accessing public housing, which even if you're on priority, it's a 2-year wait. So she's probably going to be in tour for a really long time, even if she could get onto priority. And if she was worse in terms of mental health, it would be even longer, and with no insight. And people who transitional accommodation in the ACT, because of supply issues in the broader housing market, is also extremely limited. And so someone in her position could easily have not been lucky enough to find a place at Tura and been on the streets, sleeping in a car with her kids. And in those instances, CYPS gets alerted and her kids would be taken off her. And so you can see how a small social security benefit reform that has to happen, that hasn't happened, can lead to this person being homeless, not being able to access public housing, not, potentially, sleeping in a car, having her children removed off her. And it sounds compounded as if, it's a hypothetical, but we do see cases like this all the time. And unfortunately, it's more common than we would think. And
well, how common is it? How many people in Australia are living in this situation of just being completely on the edge and relying totally on the support of other family members or charity?
Yeah, Chair, and Sarah can probably talk to this as well, but I think it's incredibly hard to know, really, because what you have is, so you have the special benefit, the non-resident waiting period, you have liquid assets tests, you have the compensation preclusion period that means that people don't have access even if they've run out of their compensation unless they're kind of going to the review. You then have people in remote and rural communities, particularly Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander people who just have no faith in the system at all, so have given up trying to get onto these payments. And there's no real, and Sarah might be able to correct me if I'm wrong here, but as far as I'm aware, there's no study into how many people are not receiving payments, because our focus is on how many people are receiving the payments. And also our focus is more specifically on how many people are receiving payments that they're not entitled to.
Thank you.
Sarah?
Yeah, I would agree with Abby there that we're talking about people who've fallen entirely through the cracks a lot of the time, so it's difficult to measure. They're not actually part of the system. So, for example, it's not just about them having no payment, it's also about them being not connected to security system in general. So if you have access to special benefit, that's a small payment, but that also connects you to employment services, for example, that keeps you in the system and being able to transition into employment. And beyond, the people that aren't on any payment at all, there are also people who are on the wrong payment, like people who have severe disability and should really be on the disability support pension. But because the eligibility criteria is so strict and because it's so inaccessible for people to navigate, they end up, and because of this sort of arbitrary program of support requirement that's built into the Act, they then end up on job seeker, and they end up really struggling to comply with mutual obligations because of their disability, because they are unable to. And then they are punished for that. Their payments are suspended, and then they might end up not on the system at all. So, and I think it's also just worth making the point here that a lot of these little barriers that we're talking about, they didn't exist in the past, and they're really easy to remove. And we saw that with respect to the COVID measures that were taken. The liquid asset period was waived. The ordinary waiting period was waived. The newly arrived residents waiting period was waived. And we also saw more support for Centrelink staff to help manage people through the system. So those things we can see are pretty arbitrary and can be quite easily removed. And they're also a kind of result of like creeping changes over the years. So for example, the newly arrived waiting period, initially that was only, when it was first introduced, it was only for 6 months. It's now crept up to 4 years. And initially it also didn't apply to special benefit. So you could still get special benefit. And special benefit, if we can hammer on this point, special benefit is absolutely essential. It's a payment of last resort. It's for people who they can't get access to any other form of income support. They need it for medicine, they need it for food. It's not a big payment, and these arbitrary barriers to it are really cruel, and they're contrary to our human rights obligations as well. But yes, back to your original question, it's difficult to measure because we're talking about people who are off the grid a lot of the time.
And of course, I mean, special benefit is even lower than job seeker. So in terms of a payment for supporting people, it's people living on special benefit. I'm sure your case studies talk about yes, how difficult it is even to be living on special benefit.
And I think it is important to talk quite a bit about special benefit, I think, because people don't realise as well that there is this waiting period, or that when you come to Australia, you are not automatically entitled for certain payments. But the other thing is that when there is those changes, and a change from 2 years to 4 years is massive, you have a whole cohort of people who have arrived in Australia who have been told in 2 years you can get this special benefit if you need it. And then they have gone to Centrelink and been told, oh, actually, sorry, that's now 4 years. You've got another 4 years you've got another 2 years to wait. And that's devastating for those clients, because they're not coming to Centrelink because they want to be there. They're coming there in really severe financial hardship. And there's that information, and it goes to what Sarah was saying, that they're not part of the system. So that they're not getting letters from Centrelink telling them these things have changed. It just changes. And then when they turn up to a service centre, that's when they're told, okay, no, 2 more years, come back.
Still trying to sort of unpack just how many people. Do we know how many people, when the COVID supplement was introduced, then with the waiving of all of those periods, how many extra people, was there any, has there been analysis, do you know, of how many extra people then got income support because of that, rather than because they were unemployed?
I'm not aware of any studies, but I'm happy to take that on notice and ask our member centres, see if we can get that information for you.
Thank you. Thank you. You also talked both in your evidence today and in your submission about the lack of resourcing of Services Australia for managing people's claims and problems they're having. Do you have an estimate of how much extra resourcing would be needed, or how, what needs to happen in order for Services Australia to be doing their job well?
I don't know if we have a number, but I would say that it's not really necessarily a matter of a huge amount of extra resourcing. It's about prioritizing that resourcing. So when you have a system that is really, really focused on compliance and on ensuring people pay debts and all of those things, that's where the resourcing goes, and it gets subsumed by the need for proper service provisions. So, for example, social workers, having social workers for people, it often will save the system money to give people access to social workers at an early stage, because they can see what certain issues are before they snowball and become much bigger problems or legal problems. And we see from our member centres that it's just really hard for people to access social workers, even when they're in crisis. They might be put off a couple of days, or especially in remote areas, it's very difficult to gain access to services. So I think that there needs to be a focus on the service provision and the types and a recognition of the kinds of vulnerabilities that people have, and for resources to be directed towards those priorities, I think would be a really important step.
And I think as well, in relation to a kind of prioritization idea, is training of staff. Because currently, and we've moved away, it used to be that you had certain staff who were trained in certain payments, and now it seems as if it's going into this more generalised, you go into a general, you see a service officer. And I'm sure everyone on the committee is aware, after sitting in so many of these hearings, that the law around this is complex. And it's very hard for one person to have an idea of the entirety of the law. So often our clients are coming to us because maybe they haven't acted on something because they spoke to a service officer and that service officer told them a certain thing that may not be entirely correct. And they'll say, well, I expected Centrelink. One of the things I hear a lot, well, I expected Centrelink to know what they were doing. It's their job. Yes. But those staff members, they're not trained in every aspect of the law. So it can be quite complicated. There's so many different payments for them to have their heads around, and so many different situations, that I think an increased specialisation in training for people would also be incredibly, incredibly useful.
Thank you. I'm now going to go to Senator Smith, who I think has got a question or two.
Actually, Janet, you just covered off on the question I was going to ask. And that was a very comprehensive answer. So thank you. But yeah, Janet, you beat me to it.
Chair, if I may.
Yes.
Just to echo Abby's comments, I think so many of the issues we see just don't need to become legal issues. They're administrative issues. And I mean, by way of example, my colleague was telling me this morning about a client she had with 6 children. She was a single mother after an experience of a history of domestic violence with another child she was expecting. And she had 2 debts raised against her. One was $40,000. And after she sought our support, she was actually paying off that debt. After she sought our support and we made some inquiries, we found that there was a coding error that led to that debt. And that's significant, and it sounds absurd. But those are the kind of things, and we see so many of those case studies come through. Those are the kind of things that a social worker can actually make a few calls and do. And it's one of those things where the less social workers you have, the more frontline workers you need to filter through an inquiry like that and unpack the complexity of it. And, Abby was very rightly pointing out the fact that it's currently a compliance-based system as opposed to a needs-based catering and understanding the needs of people. People who are experiencing family violence, who are paranoid about ex-partners finding out things, people who have language barriers, people who have mental health concerns, people with intellectual disabilities such as ADHD, which makes it hard for them to interact and understand bureaucracy Indigenous people with mistrust of authorities are not going to explain everything to a frontline worker with very limited training in legal support and social work support. They need to be able to sit down with a social worker, explain, build that trust, explain the complexity of their situation, and have that personalised support, which community legal centres quite often end up providing to these people, and that takes our resources away from what we could be helping people with more complex legal issues. And we definitely found, when there was a little bit more social work support, which we knew of in the past, we would just sometimes tell clients to go and see a social worker at Centrelink, and their issue would be sorted out. But with that becoming less and less and harder to access, that's taking up a lot of our resources, and it's causing people a lot of distress, and it's entrenching poverty in the meantime.
Thank you. Your two final recommendations, M and N, are about funding. So just be interested for you to talk through both of those. The first one, providing funding to enable the establishment of a Centrelink nationwide specialist hotline for community legal centre advocates. So what would that look like?
Yeah, this is something that we have been advocating for a while, and basically the reason why an advocacy line is needed is because of the de-skilling of Centrelink staff in general. They often don't have the expertise or the discretion to deal with complex cases or to understand how review rights and processes work. And often when people come into a CLC, that is their one opportunity to handle an issue. Like, for example, if they are homeless and they don't have an address and the lawyer has to deal with it on the spot or risk them missing out entirely. If they could have a line to somebody with the relevant expertise that could really assist people in getting access to justice. And I'm sure Abby and Tabitha can speak to how difficult it is to get through to Services Australia when it's such a complex bureaucracy and it's so difficult to get the right person, and leaving it to individuals to do it, it's virtually impossible. Barriers there. So that's really a way for us to cut through and get that access, and yes, that's a really important ask for us. I'll leave that to Abby if she wants to add.
I have a lot to say on that. So there's a few things, and I do actually have a case study that really emphasises quite a bit of the issues here. But when clients come to us, particularly if they're not yet at the tribunal, it's almost impossible to have any information from Centrelink that allows us to even begin our job. So our first step, if someone comes to us before the tribunal, is to say, we're going to need to do a Freedom of Information request, and that's going to take a month. So straight out of the gate, you're a month waiting for the information that then allows us to give legal advice. So our legal advice could then be, you've got no chance, or this just isn't kind of happening. But it's a month delayed. And so some of that is EJA is providing a lot of advocacy also around the amount of information that's included in letters, like rejection letters and things like that, so that we can provide that advice without going through the process. But an advocate's line may also be useful in those situations where you can get a quick update. The other thing is, so I assisted a woman who was in a long and very severe domestically violent relationship. And at the end of that relationship, she came to us because she was incredibly concerned. She had extreme anxiety and PTSD. She was very concerned that Centrelink were going to raise a debt against her, which happens. She had been saying that she was single when she was in fact partnered, and there's also some submissions that we've made around those debt waiver provisions that are relevant to her matter. But the issue that actually came up is that we sent a letter through to Centrelink to say, here is her circumstances. We do not consider that she should be taken as a member of a couple, and a debt shouldn't be raised, because this was 5 years. So if it had have been raised, it could have been a criminal prosecution. It then took 8 months for me to talk to Centrelink to talk, well, not to
8
talk
months.
to Centrelink, 8 months, for me to talk to someone in Centrelink who could give me an answer as to what had happened with that letter, whether they were going to do anything with it. And part of that was because they didn't recognise my legal authority. They were telling me I had to be a nominee for this client, which is horrifically inappropriate. And then when I did finally get through to someone through their complaints process who could tell me what was going on, what I was told was, yes, we received your letter in October last year. I can see that someone's looked at it. There's been no actions, but we can't tell you that we're not going to raise a debt. But people have looked at it. No one is currently raising a debt. They probably won't. We can't say no. So I then had to go back to this woman with severe anxiety who was worried she was going to go to prison and say, 90% chance that everything is fine. But that's as good as we can give you. And that was after 8 months of trying to get through to them.
Thank you. It's pretty sobering and very, very important information for us as a committee to hear, I think. Ms. Sivasamy?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Abby's case study was incredible, and I don't know if mine would do as much justice, but I do have an example that's springing to mind about which demonstrates the need for a hotline to ascertain those updates as soon as possible. I recently had a client, Miranda, who the community housing provider that she was with, they had already tried to evict her because she wasn't paying rent, and she was successful in getting a payment order instead of being evicted, which was a great outcome. Unfortunately, her job seeker payments fell through because, all sort of things happen. And she, the community service housing provider then took her back to the tribunal to try and evict her for breaching the payment order. It was so tragic, and it almost sounds crazy, but she didn't come to the hearing she didn't come to the hearing and she had been evicted for breaching the payment order. And she came running to the tribunal right afterwards saying, I was locked up in a watchtower. I got arrested at 11 o'clock last night. I had no way of contacting you. I'm so sorry. And then we told her the bad news, and she broke down crying. What we then did was we made an application to set aside ex parte orders on the basis that she wasn't, and we had to demonstrate as a part of that she had a reasonable excuse for non-attendance, and that her attendance would have made a material difference to the outcome. We emailed, before that set-aside hearing, we tried to contact Centrelink for an update on her job seeker payments, which she had applied weeks before. She applied actually about 5 weeks before, and then apparently the application didn't go through, and this is where her mental health barriers and intellectual disability barriers prevented her from making those inquiries and understanding the process and engaging with the system, which was very compliance driven. But she had to make the application again, which she still made about 3 weeks before this hearing, and hadn't received. Every time she followed up for an update, she was not getting any meaningful updates. And we reached out to Centrelink, and in the meantime her set-aside hearing happened. The member decided that because she was unable to give any updates about her Centrelink payments coming through anytime soon, there was no proof that she could comply with the payment order, and so the orders weren't set aside, and it was the case that she was evicted. We got the update from Centrelink later on, but it was too late. And it shows how, from taking a step back from a legalistic point of view, this woman couldn't make it to a hearing because she was locked up. Her phone was off her. She had no way of contacting us. And her bail hearing was just, I think it was about 15 minutes before her housing hearing. And it's sad because a simple update from Centrelink really could have changed that outcome. We appealed the decision, and it was found that even though it was open to the member to adjourn the matter possibly, that adjournment was likely, or on appeal it was held that adjournment would likely have not been granted because there was not enough evidence for the member to consider that there may have been a change in circumstances, and a Centrelink update would have changed that. And it was just a shame because we got the email a few days later and it was just too late. And, you know, we have been, in the past, we have been able to get those updates sooner, but because those mechanisms aren't there, we don't, you know, those are through informal contacts at Centrelink, which not everyone has, you know, and it's just, yeah, well, that's just a very tragic example. And she's homeless now, so I don't even know where she is. But
it's awful.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing it, and thank you for all the work that you were doing supporting people. And I mean, I note your last recommendation of extra funding for one additional position. I think that's the least that, yes. I know that you'd be able to do an awful lot with that. So, look, thank you very much for your evidence today. I think you did take something on notice. So if you could get information back to us by the close of business on the 17th of March, that would be really appreciated. And we're going to be reporting to the Senate on the 31st of October. So thank you. And
Thank you, Chair.
We will now suspend for 5 minutes so that I can get a cup of tea. Thank you.
Worthy cause, Janet.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. There's a session now, wasn't it? We've still got another hour to go before lunch. Yeah, thank you for everyone who's dropped by and had made a comment. I figured if I was going to be watching this, I'd rather not watch it alone, so thanks. Stuff should be done alone, right? Yeah, meds check for anyone who needs to take midday meds. Yeah, or if you haven't taken your breakfast ones yet, probably get on that. Hey, heavy stuff. Yeah, yeah, okay. Advil. Yeah, melatonin. Yeah, so you said you didn't sleep last night, so but ow. I got caught up on my earrings earlier. 9 p.m. last night. Oh, pain. Yeah. Sorry to hear that. I slept well last night. Yeah. Wasn't. I guess I was a little too hot, but yeah, it's up and down like that. So. Yeah. I don't have our music playing. I'm sad. They didn't give us the music. Senate hold meeting at 9 p.m. last night. Oh, didn't even see that bit the first time I read that, so that's how good my eyes are jumping around the page. Thanks. So what have we got up after this? We've got, after this short break, oh, this is Economic Justice Australia, and then we've got ACOS after this, so, and Uniting Care Australia. Having a chat about us, not to us, like with us, about forwards and twirling. Yeah, I'm sure it gets posted to the Senate site. I'll get the let's do this. So on the Anti-Poverty Centre post that I've linked there at the top, that's got the link in there to all the that witness list one. That's got all the link to the actual inquiry that we're watching now. So, and that'll be recorded. They should post a transcript as well. So yeah, and there should be previous sessions. Yeah, and it's all in. Yeah, it's all stored somewhere. Just a matter of how long it takes for them to do it. So probably sometimes they're a bit slower on these than they are in some of the more popular inquiries. But yeah, should be up there. Most of the submissions, a lot of them get posted as well on the website and the individual organisations' websites will be posting them too. And yeah, Let's save that. Oops, sorry. No, I don't want to replace that one. I've already got that saved. Yeah. I should put my own music on. In the diner around the corner, blah 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 blah. Oh, that's. Yeah. Meanwhile, over in Tom's commentary on the Rabbitoh Royal Commission and all the non-answers we're getting from the public servants there. Oh, I didn't think it was too bad. Oh, it was only slightly illegal. Oh, they didn't say it was not illegal, so it's illegal. So, yeah. What? Weasel words. Weasel words. Yeah, meanwhile, they're still, doing debt collection and reassumed all these payment collections from everyone. And just because it's using a slightly different system, or one person checks it now, it's not robo-debt anymore because it's not completely automated. And yeah, doesn't mean it's not completely devastating to people getting their lives ruined by this. Yeah. Well, it was working out as intended, wasn't it? It's a deterrent for people to apply. It's all those good things. Alright, I'm gonna have a loo break myself. I'll be back.
Hands are ready. So I now welcome via video conference and in person representatives from the Australian Council of Social Service, who we've got people online, and Uniting Care Australia. Thank you for appearing before the committee today. So for the Hansard record, will you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today, starting with the wonderful people we've got here in person.
Ms Claire Little, National Director, Uniting Care Australia.
Mark Newton, I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Parramatta Mission.
Thank you, Mr Newton. And ACOS, who have we got online?
So it's Cassandra Goldie, appearing as Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Council of Social Service Centre.
Thank you, Ms Goldie. Or Dr Goldie, sorry. Have we got...
And we should be joined by my colleague, Charmaine Crowe.
Yes, I can see Charmaine.
Yeah, g'day. Charmaine Crowe, Program Director of Social Security at ACOS.
Great, thank you. And have we got Dr Davidson? Doesn't look like it. Are we expecting him?
Yes.
Yes, oh well, he will join us, I'm sure. So thank you for...
There he is.
All right, great. So Dr Davidson, we're just getting names and capacity in which you appear for the Hansard record. So.
Sorry about that, just unmuting myself. Dr Peter Davidson, and I'm Principal Advisor at ACOS.
Thank you very much. So I'll now invite both organisations to make an opening statement before we will ask you some questions. As well as myself, the Chair, here in the room, we've got Senators Smith and Brockman on the line, and we have got Senator Tyrrell joining us via teleconference. So, Uniting Care, would you like to go first? Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you, Senator Rice. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future, and recommit to working for reconciliation in this land. Thank you very much for the opportunity to appear before the committee today on this important issue. I have with me Mr Mark Newton, CEO of Parramatta Mission, as you'd heard, one of the many services within the Uniting Care network. Parramatta Mission has been providing vital support services for over 150 years, as it started in the late 1880s as one of the churches within the Parramatta region, and they see thousands of vulnerable people every day in Western Sydney. As the national body for the Uniting Care network, our work is grounded in the value and vision of the Uniting Church in Australia, the expertise of our services and the experience of the 1.4 million people we serve each year. The Uniting Church pledged in 1977 at its inception to seek the correction of injustices and work for the eradication of poverty. We are here to continue that mission today. Senators, you have heard about the deeply concerning rates and impacts of poverty in Australia. A number of Uniting Care organisations from our network of 80,000 staff and volunteers have given evidence of the lived experience of people we support and what practical solutions should be enacted to end poverty in this country across other hearings. Our services are on the front line every day, doing the best they can to ameliorate the effects of poverty, often intergenerational, providing financial, physical, emotional and spiritual support. As one of the wealthiest countries in the world, it is unacceptable and unconscionable for people in our community to still be living in poverty. The existence of poverty not only diminishes those individuals and families that experience it, but it diminishes us all. We should not allow even one member of our community to languish without adequate means of support for themselves and those they care for. Poverty is the outcome of intentional policy decisions on issues such as taxation, social security, income support, housing, employment, education and community service provision. We are not just at a flashpoint of the current cost of living crisis. Poverty is a structural problem that needs structural solutions. We commend to you the policies and recommendations in our submission, which will enhance the dignity of people, especially those who are most vulnerable. We hope that the recommendations of this inquiry will inform the many important legislative and policy reforms underway in the 47th Parliament, especially the focus on a national wellbeing framework and economic equality and inclusion. And we also hope that the voices that have been heard through this process will echo through these chambers as a timely reminder that we can and we must do better as a country to eradicate poverty
and set us all on a path of human rights and human dignity. Thank you. We look forward to the discussion ahead.
Thank you, Ms Little. Dr Goldie.
Thank you, Senator. May I thank the committee for the opportunity for ACOS to present evidence to you today. ACOS is the peak body for the community sector, and our core purpose is to work with government and with others to end poverty in Australia. And we commend the Senate for initiating this very important inquiry, and at this time. No one should be living in poverty. Australia is, on some measures, one of the wealthiest countries in the world alongside Switzerland. And we have all the means within our power to end poverty if we choose to do so. ACOS advocates for policies, legislation and action to end poverty and inequality. We draw on the experience also of people who are directly affected and the deep expertise across the ACOS membership, including our colleagues from Uniting Care appearing with you today. And this inquiry has already heard a lot of evidence about the corrosive effects on poverty on the experience of people directly affected. Like Catherine, who agreed to be in the media last week with us as we released our latest survey about the corrosive effects of heat when you do not have enough to be able to cool your homes. As she said, due to there not being any affordable rents for a single person, I am currently living in someone's shed. The extremes of heat and cold are hard to take. It is currently 24 degrees outside, and yet it is 29 degrees inside the shed where I live. Can you imagine what it is like when it's 35 degrees outside? And in regional Australia, we have many areas now where over half the year we have temperatures of over 35 degrees. You will have heard how poverty removes people's agency and limits opportunity. It takes away our independence. It leads to a corrosive decline in health, both physical and mental, and it is a cause of deep social isolation and stress in terms of our human relationships. It places people in situations where they must make impossible choices between eating or getting essential medical care. And the research is very clear that women in poverty are more likely to be experiencing family and domestic violence. And I quote, "There is a real social aspect to the increased cost of living. Aside from getting to vital appointments, I can't afford additional fuel to visit family or friends, and I can't afford to buy additional food to invite them over, even for a meal or a coffee. I'm embarrassed and increasingly isolated. The lack of social contact is debilitating." This is the person living on JobSeeker. Another, "I can no longer afford my medications. I am in excruciating pain and there's nothing I can do about any of it." Another person trying to survive on JobSeeker. Another, "I was so sad when I realised that many of my health problems were due to not eating properly, and that was due to poverty." The voice of a single parent living in Australia today. As I hope senators from this committee will hear over and over again, we are very clear about the solutions to lifting people out of poverty. The federal government demonstrated it right back in the late 80s when it lifted and promoted family payments, which reduced child poverty by around 30% at that time. And when the federal government lifted the pension in 2009, poverty among people receiving the age pension dropped almost by half, from 27% to 15%. And in 2020, poverty among people receiving income support as their main income source was massively reduced, literally overnight, temporarily, however, thanks to the coronavirus supplement. And our research from our colleagues at the University of New South Wales, so the Poverty and Inequality Partnership, has a lot of detail about the evidence to establish just how transformative increasing income supports have been in tackling poverty. So we will again say to you today as senators, we urge you to be a strong voice to call for the lifting of income supports, job seeker and youth allowance. They are our top recommendations in this committee. Poverty is a lack of income in the face of the costs that you must meet to be able to live with a level of dignity. And the biggest risk to living on poverty is to be either relying on income support payments like job seeker and youth allowance and parenting payment. Job seeker remains the second lowest unemployment payment amongst wealthy countries as a proportion of average earnings, and is currently just 42% of the minimum wage. In our view, these payments need to be lifted to at least the pension rate. The pension was comprehensively assessed for its adequacy back in the Harmer Review, and our view is it's very clear that the income support payments should be lifted to at least that level. We also call for the government to commit to a full employment target, supporting people to get into paid work, which is so essential to reducing poverty. We have a historic opportunity to deliver on full employment and continue to do everything we can to give people who are trying to get access to paid work the supports they need in order to do so. You will have heard a lot about housing. The lack of housing is such an essential problem when it comes to people who do not have adequate income. So social housing and lifting the adequacy of Commonwealth rent assistance. I do want to highlight that we also are very conscious of people on temporary visas who have historically too often been left in destitution. We need to put in place adequate social protections for people on a range of temporary visas in Australia, including financial assistance for people seeking asylum and for temporary migrants, benchmarked to a similar rate as access to income support. We have strongly welcomed the federal government's commitment to developing a wellbeing framework. This presents an enormous opportunity for us to focus policies and to get them right for the health of the people in our community. In our view, the wellbeing framework should include a national headline poverty measure and targets, and so that we can clearly understand the nature and extent of poverty in Australia and make sure that with every effort we take, we are helping to end it. With the establishment of the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee, we consider that poverty reduction should be a core legislative purpose of its mandate, with its strong focus being on income support adequacy, which is so crucial to ending poverty in Australia. We commend you, senators, for this inquiry, and we look forward to the discussion alongside our colleagues from Uniting Care. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Goldie. I'll start, just prompted by one of the things you just said to the end there, that we need a national headline poverty measure and targets. I was going to ask the question, do you think Australia needs a national definition of poverty? So starting with ACOSS, I mean, you said we do. How should that be developed, and where, in ACOSS's terms, do you have a view as to where that should sit now, or do you think there needs to be more work to be done to determine what that should be?
Look, Senator, it's so crucial that we get a national government that is prepared to undertake the important work to develop the right measure of poverty in Australia. That was really crucial work that was done about the nature and extent of homelessness. That was done some time ago with the ABS to really do the proper inquiry to set the right measures on homelessness. And since then we have been able to, with the no debate about the trends and what we're seeing. We think the same kind of process is needed here. I will refer to Dr. Davidson. I think it would be great, Peter, for you to speak to some of our views associated with the measures of poverty in Australia. Peter has led our work with the University of New South Wales in the analysis that we've been doing about poverty and inequality, and I'm sure, Senator, it would be useful to hear Peter's views on this front. Right. Thank you.
Thanks. Can't hear you, Dr. Davidson. You're still on mute, I think. Yes.
There, got me. Sorry. I'm muting and unmuting in the wrong order. Broadly speaking, I think we define poverty as insufficient income to meet minimum basic living costs, that is, socially perceived necessities. So that's not an absolute measure. It will vary from country to country and within Australia from time to time as living standards change. But if you can't afford what most people perceive to be essentials, like a decent and secure home, then because your income's too low, then you're in poverty. How exactly that is measured, by what benchmark, is a matter for discussion and debate, and we think there should be a process of public review, perhaps as part of the development of the wellbeing framework, to develop that, because there are a number of benchmarks for poverty, including 50% or 60% of median household income, with or without housing costs, and the Henderson poverty line. And then there are other measures, more direct measures of deprivation and hardship, which aren't set as income benchmarks. And finally, there are budget standards measures which attempt to work out a minimum acceptable budget, looking at each item that a low-income household needs, from housing to groceries to transport and so on. And there's research around that as well. So I guess we think it's important to look at the results from each of those methods, each of those approaches, and if the same people come into view on virtually every one of those measures, then you'd conclude that they're at high risk of poverty.
Thanks, Dr. Davidson. Uniting Care, do you have a view as to what the poverty line should look like, how it should be determined?
Well, pretty much agree with what ACOS was saying there around poverty definitions, etc. Last year, though, we undertook a piece of research with ANU to look at household financial stress and financial wellbeing in Australia, to look at whether there's a bit more of a comprehensive measure of what financial wellbeing looks like. There is absolutely no doubt that income is core and centre to that, but we looked at other issues such as a household's wealth, age, housing costs, family type, disability status, gender, education level and region. And we combined all of those factors with ANU into one index that was based on how they impact household financial stress. And that sort of, it measures how hard it is for people to meet their expenses and have some money left over, so that when the unexpected bill does arrive, they have the means to pay for it from their weekly income or savings. We thought it was important to consider those raft of factors just so that it gives us a bit more of a comprehensive picture. So what we found, of course, was, there was no surprise, and essentially found very similar to the other poverty research that's happened across the country, that 8 out of 10 people dependent on working age welfare payments such as JobSeeker experienced the lowest financial wellbeing on that index. That 3 in 10 households earning wages and salaries are living in financial stress. It talked about lower income families are 4 times more likely to be in financial stress compared with high income families, and about 1/3 of households on the age pension are living with financial stress. Single parents rated very poorly as well, as we know from other research. They're twice as likely to suffer financial stress compared to couples with children. But this was just a way of looking at it a bit more comprehensively and saying it's not just about income, that if we are financially stressed, there are many other factors that can be combined with that. For example, 2 people might have an income of $65,000, but if one of them is a homeowner retiree with $1.3 million in super and the other is a single parent renter raising 2 children, their lived experience is vastly different. So absolutely agree with our ACOS colleagues. Poverty, we need a proper national conversation around poverty, which of course this Senate inquiry is very well and truly started, and we also need to look at how we measure that and look at that wellbeing index. We've called in our measuring what matters submission around the social development goals and looking at how we can measure the proper measure of wellbeing, and the index that we developed with ANU goes some way towards that.
Thank you. Just very much hearing those recommendations that we need to do the work, we need to work out, and add in those factors and to have a benchmark or an index that is for the Australian context. Just wanted to go at the moment, with the two main measures of, 50% of median income or 60% and the Henderson poverty line. Just your views. I mean, I've had it put to me that the 50% or 60% or 50% of median income doesn't take into account higher housing costs in Australia, and just be interested in your response to that, given that in the absence of that well-defined index, that's often what is being used to determine when people are living in poverty.
Sorry, looking at me? Yes, indeed. So that's why we did some of that work with ANU, really, when the Financial Wellbeing Index it did take into account higher costs of housing and higher costs of living in regional areas that had a demographic component to it as well, just so that there was a sense of balance in that. So absolutely think that we need to be a bit more nuanced now around that. We have a lot more people who are on even on double incomes who are what we would call the working poor at the moment as well. And so I think we need to really look at how we can be a bit more comprehensive. So would love to put the work that we've started into that mix and say, how do we have some of those measures that's a bit more nuanced than just income, knowing that income is actually, at the bottom, at the end of the day, if you can't pay your bills and you can't feed your children, then that is not acceptable. So I think we need to have a good, solid conversation about what we want to measure and how we want to measure it. The 50% of median household income has served us well. The poverty line has served us well, but I think being above or below a line may not be for now something that we could actually build on.
Thank you. ACOS?
I'll take that if that's okay. Housing is the largest single cost that households face, especially low-income households, and it also varies very dramatically. For example, it's much, much higher for low-income households of working age than for the majority of older households, the ones who aren't renting. And so there is a tradition in poverty research to directly take into account housing costs, and that's what we do in our work with UNSW. So it's not so much about the level of the poverty line itself, it's whether you directly take into account housing costs, and we do by deducting median household housing costs from the median income measure that we've used in that research, 50% of median income, and then to set the poverty lines, and then deducting individual households' housing costs from their income. And so what that captures is the impact of different households' housing costs on poverty, and the resulting poverty measures are slightly higher than when you don't take housing into account, but we think it's important to do so, and we do that.
Okay, so the ACOS position at the moment of increasing income support to essentially what the age pension is, $73 a day. How does that take into account those housing costs?
It doesn't directly. The component of income support that takes account of housing costs is rent assistance. So it's a question of to what degree you focus on the core payment and to what degree you focus on the rental subsidy and, of course, other policies to boost low-cost housing supply.
I can add to that. So, of course, as part of our income support ask is the ask to increase rent assistance so that it better reflects the rents paid by people receiving income support. And we're calling for an increase to the maximum threshold for rent assistance of 50%, and that would in turn lift the payment. The data is very clear that the people most at risk of housing stress are people receiving job seeker payment, students, in terms of those households receiving rent assistance at the same time. And that's primarily because although they're receiving the same level of rent assistance, say, as their counterpart on a pension, their base rate of income is that much lower. And so there are a much higher proportion of people receiving those payments who we classify as being in rental stress because they're paying more than 30% of their income on rent, compared with people receiving a higher level of payment. So it's important to acknowledge that in terms of being able to cover the cost of housing, we obviously need investment in social housing to boost those numbers, but rent assistance obviously plays an important role, in addition to, very importantly, lifting the base rates of those very low and inadequate income support payments like job seeker and youth allowance.
Right, so you couldn't have oh, go on.
Oh, Senator, if I may, just as I referenced in the opening statement, we've come to that view about the benchmarking of job seeker to be at the pension rate, based on comprehensive consultation that we had to develop a clear position, including with our members, over the adequacy of the unemployment payment. The reasons are twofold. One is, as I said earlier, the most comprehensive work that we've had done on adequacy overall. It has been the Harmer Review, which set a fresh benchmark for the pension rate and also agreed a much more adequate, in our view, indexation arrangements associated with that payment. Secondly, as you will be aware, we've had successive governments introduce or tighten rules associated with who gets access to a pension rate of payment, and who gets access to an allowance rate. And the gap between those two payments has become unconscionable in our view. And it has also meant that people have been placed in terrible situations. For example, people with a partial capacity to work, of having to try and get access to the disability support pension because it is at least more than job seeker. And the rules associated with access to the disability support pension, of course, require you, for example, to say that your condition is chronic, ongoing, and you will never actually get your capacity back. We don't need to do that. The reality is, whether you've got a disability or you are, in another situation, the cost of housing essentially is the same. We argue for a supplementation for disability-associated costs, but there is policy coherence in us coming to essentially a universal income floor, regardless of your circumstances, if you're not able to be in paid work, and then we can have the debates about the so-called conditionality associated with remaining on that payment, depending on who you are in that system. Thank you.
And then what I hear you saying is then that income floor, and then how much it would need to be supplemented,
yes.
EGB,
that's right.
with rent assistance.
We call for a supplement for disability costs, chronic illness costs, and you will hear over and over again the aspects of that for people in terms of going in without critical costs like medicines. And of course, if you have a chronic illness, your costs are much higher in that regard. And then also single parent supplementation. And I know we're going to talk a bit about family payments, I'm sure, in the context of family poverty.
Can I just we had some quite strong criticism of Commonwealth rent assistance. And I understand your position. You're saying we need to raise income support and then have Commonwealth rent assistance on top of that. But this morning, and a couple of things were that it's not payable until you have got your name on the lease, and that there are big barriers and the administrative burden of having these two processes that people have to go through with Centrelink. So I'd just like your response to those criticisms of CRA.
Charmaine, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, look, they're fair, absolutely. I mean, I think if we were to lift the base rates of those completely inadequate income support payments, that would definitely go some way to assisting people receiving them where they were trying to get a private rental. You know, ACOS has policies in other areas to also ensure that people don't have to run down their meagre savings just to even get access to income support. So, for instance, we're calling for abolition of the liquid assets waiting period. That means that people have to deplete, as I said, meagre savings just to even get access to JobSeeker. We're also calling for the removal of waiting periods, like the 1 week wait, which just simply denies people in need access to support. And so if they do have any savings, they're normally gone by the time that people get their income support payment transferred. But as I said earlier, we also need to boost the supply of affordable housing. Now, we acknowledge that that is going to take time, and that is why, in our view, Commonwealth rent assistance absolutely has a role to play in our system of support to ensure that where people are in the private rental market, they are receiving a payment that acknowledges the higher costs that they face.
If we were asked what's the highest priority, it is absolutely lifting the adequacy of JobSeeker, Senator, for all the reasons that you've heard this morning. In the rental market out there at the moment, it is horrendous for people. And many people, of course, are in informal housing situations. They're not getting themselves on the lease because at the moment the landlord has the power, as we know, about whether to agree to that. And so there are many, many people in informal rental situations who are absolutely paying rent, but they can't access Commonwealth rent assistance. And so we think it's really important that we get the adequacy of the core payment right. And then, you know, obviously we do have views about the need to lift Commonwealth rent assistance. In terms of the whole housing situation, no question for us, the big boost has to be in what's at the moment called social housing, the very, you know, income tied to, rent tied to income part of the housing continuum, because that is where we've got, you know, declining stock. And to, you know, our colleagues at Uniting Care talk about when you look at the back end of financial stresses, there's no question that, and, you know, as our colleague Peter Davison highlights as well, housing is your biggest cost and everything else gets squeezed out until you finally let go of housing, become homeless.
Yes.
Hope your medicines.
About to go to Senator Smith, who's got some questions, but just one last question from me on that lack of availability of social and community and public housing. Do your organisations have a figure of what quantum of housing that needs to be committed to do some substantial work to alleviating that?
Charmaine, thank you.
I'll go to Ms. Little first.
No, that's fine. I mean, we have been supporting the Everybody's Home campaign, and so the figures that they have are the figures that we think at this point in time, you know, are probably the best guess. The lived experience of the people, and I might throw to Mark too on this one, the lived experience of the people who access our services is absolutely dire. It is a crisis, and, you know, our emergency relief programs are giving out tents. They are, you know, people are living in their cars, going to their work, raising their children, you know, in absolutely unacceptable situations. And so, you know, the best guess at this point in time is the rate that Everybody's Home has been quoting. But I tell you what, I think it's getting worse and worse as days go by, and you can only talk to any of our services to know that. And someone like Mark, whose service works with the homeless population, will absolutely attest to that.
Thanks, Ms Edel. Ms Newton?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great introduction. Parramatta Mission sees around 300 people a day who are either homeless or bordering on homelessness, and those people have a variety of challenging circumstances. They typically would have fallen through most of the government safety nets in their daily existence. There would be groups of them who would live couch surfing, who would be living in their cars, who would be trying to find whatever opportunities for a good night's sleep might be available. But their situations are not only dire but complex, typically because of a combination of mental health challenges, drug and alcohol challenges, disability, family breakdown and violence. There may be recent migrants. There may be all of those things in some cases, so that they come together, that those people would not only be interacting with the welfare systems, but probably the criminal justice system in many cases. And this is the most challenging end of poverty, and typically results in either complete homelessness and rough sleeping, or results in those people having to find accommodation which is absolutely suboptimal, that they have no security of either food or income or residence. So I think when we speak about poverty and we speak about homelessness, obviously there is a spectrum, and my organisation seeks to take care of those at the very bottom of that spectrum. So just to recognise that there is that profound need in many communities.
Thank you, Mr Newton. Ms Crowe?
Yeah, yes, we also support the Everybody's Home campaign. We've got in our submission, you'll see the call for at least 25,000 dwellings per year constructed over a 10-year basis. That's what we're asking for the federal government to commit to go some way to addressing the severe shortfall of social housing.
Great. Thank you. Senator Smith.
Thank you, and thanks to the witnesses appearing today. Just had some questions for ACOS, which go to pages 87 to 89 of your submission, just around early childhood and access to preschool. So I was just hoping to start with, you could speak to why you've included these recommendations in your submission to us on poverty. If we could start with the access to early childhood one.
Oh, thank you, Senator. I mean, you don't get. I think we have had a long-standing call for elevating the affordability and the sort of essentially universal access to early childhood education and care, because it is great for children, and it's also really great for a range of different kinds of families who are looking to be able to cover the costs of the essential, to be able to, as appropriate, to retain access to participation in paid work, so that there can be essentially a smoothing of supports for families as children come into the world, and then you are wanting to give them the very best of a start in life, and early childhood education and care is so crucial to that. We were strongly opposed, for example, to the activity tests that was put in place, which definitely penalised and blocked out access to adequate early childhood care for particularly lower income families, and we'll continue to call for that to be removed. We think this is one of the really crucial debates for the country about how to best design access to high quality early childhood education and care. We are not where we should be, certainly in terms of global standards, and it's important for everybody. It's particularly important for families whose choices are constrained because of their need to participate in paid work in order to cover the essentials.
And do you see a role for access to high quality early education and care in tackling issues like intergenerational poverty and disadvantage?
For us, definitely, for all families, we think having high quality access to early childhood education and care really gives children the kind of capacity to participate outside of the home, for the families to be connected around the early childhood education and care. We've had a long-standing concern about the increasing sort of tiers of access to quality. We don't think that if we get this wrong, it drives inequalities and sense of people's and families not having the same kinds of supports, that you've got to kind of buy your way in to something so essential as high quality early education and care.
Okay, and you included a separate recommendation around 3-year-old preschool, where you recommended access to 3-year-old preschool. Can I just ask you to expand on that recommendation?
I might just, Charmaine, are you in a position to speak to that one?
Look, our colleague Rob Starrick can probably provide further detail if the committee is keen to get that. But in short, that is really about ensuring that young children have access to that, high quality early learning at a really critical time. And we also call for priority to be given to children who may be experiencing or be at an educational disadvantage, particularly children or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, children who are in rural and remote areas where there again is poor access, and also kids from or with a non-English speaking background.
Okay, I think if you could just take on notice for me, I assume these recommendations are in here because your research or your work either shows that lack of access to these things is a driver of poverty, or improvement in these things is a potential way to help overcome some of the intergenerational causes of poverty. So I'd just be interested if there's further detail you can give in support of these recommendations and why they are on notice. I'd really appreciate that. And I guess
the connection, just to clarify, in terms of it being a driver of poverty, is obviously if you, for example, are a single parent and you don't have access to this kind of care in a way that's affordable, it is a barrier for you to be able to participate in paid work, but also essentially to have the kind of social connections and supports that are really meaningful for you as a member of our community. And so, it's not like this is about fixing up kids per se, but it is recognising these are structural barriers that make your experience very different depending on whether or not you are able to, have the kind of access to early childhood education and care for your children that you would want, in contrast to those who are really on, in extreme situations in terms of their lack of access to income.
Okay, so from a policy perspective, these recommendations are in here more in terms of their impact on adults or parents living in poverty, as opposed to the intergenerational preventative considerations of early childhood education. Is that what you're saying?
Sandra, if it might help, we know that families experiencing poverty are more disadvantaged when it comes to getting access to those early learning services, if I can put it that way. And so the kids are at a greater disadvantage. If that clarifies things a bit further.
That's helpful. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I'll return to Uniting Care, and you note in your submission that in addition to increasing income support, there's a need to fund service providers, and that many, as Mr Newton I'm sure would well know, aren't meeting demand, and we've heard a lot of evidence to this committee up until now as to the huge strain. So could you just sort of talk us through what is the gap that you are experiencing as a service provider at the moment, and do you have a sense of how much more support is needed I suppose it depends on whether income support is increased, doesn't it?
Well, yes, thank you. So we know, and I think our ACOS colleagues mentioned it earlier, that when during COVID, when the COVID supplement was increased and job seeker was increased significantly, we noted a direct correlation to the decrease in the draw on emergency relief and food. So there is a direct correlation between having a raise to your income and your income support levels to the access to services. So it was really quite obvious at the time, and notably when those payments went down, so our demand on services went up, and it has continued to go up since then because we now also have a cost of living crisis. And so some of our emergency relief, particularly at that end, which is kind of the pointy end, if you like, of need, we're seeing 50%, at least 50% increase across the board in our services for demand for food and emergency relief, which is vouchers, helping to pay the rent, helping to pay utilities, etc. So we are seeing a big spike at the moment. There's also, a really strong increase in demand for mental health services, for drug and alcohol programs, for domestic and family violence programs. So there is a need. We haven't quantified that in terms of dollars at this point. What we are asking is that there is a mapping and that there is a proper service review about how much the need is going to be for the next few years, so that we can really fund it appropriately. And of course, we also have a workforce crisis, so our services are also under strain, and we know that we've also called for a jobs and skills. In the new Jobs and Skills Australia, we've called for a Deputy Commissioner for the care sector, so that we can address the workforce crisis that we are currently seeing within our programs. So we'd like to see a review so that there's a proper understanding of what that quantification is. We know it anecdotally, we know it from our data across various services, but a real national kind of picture of that, I think, would be very, very helpful at this point.
Mr. Newton, did you want to comment about, the strain that the services that you run have been under with that increase in people living in poverty?
Oh, absolutely. We've seen, as Clevin said, a significant increase, approaching 50% on some of our programs. There's obviously a professionalisation of many services. What Parramatta Mission now provides is an unfunded government service to those people in need. And we've seen around 50% increase in that. And we're seeing a new, cohort of people coming through seeking help. Those people who are actually not homeless and in some cases are employed, but because of the stress on family budgets, they come and seek food relief. So either meals in the morning or at lunchtime, or food parcels, things that they can take away, and also to be able to seek support in interacting with the complex array of government programs and schemes that are available, that they really otherwise would struggle to navigate their way through those programs. And so therefore we're able to provide a community hub, but it is salutary to realise that there are people coming who are in work and who do have a stable domestic situation, but really their income and expenses are so much under pressure that they're seeking food and other benefits from unfunded charities.
And I mean, so you say we've, in fact, for both of you, you've had an massive increase in demand of the 50%, but what's happened to the funding from government to your services?
There was an increase in emergency relief funding through COVID, which is and also through some of the, of course, we've had weather events and other crises as well in our country over the last couple of years. So there was some increase. Essentially, we are, as Mark said, I mean, his service is completely unfunded. It is all voluntary and charitable donations that are feeding the people of Parramatta in from his program every day. So we are, essentially trying to draw on donations, looking for other sources of funding. But essentially, at the end of the day, we have to turn people away. And that is heartbreaking. In fact, we have some reports from our programs that says that in some cases, the mental health of our workers, because they have to turn people away, it's really having an impact on service deliverers in that they're already exhausted, and having been through a pandemic, they're already feeling really overwhelmed. So we have a workforce crisis, we have an increase in demand, and we need to look seriously at what the level of funding should be for the future. At the moment, we're getting by.
Thank you. Yes.
If I may, just it is one of the reasons why ACOS has, in our most recent budget submission, again called for the federal government to undertake a proper benchmarking assessment of the adequacy of community services. It's been a very long time since that has been done, from right back at the sort of 2013-14 history with the so-called horror budget of the Abbott government, where there was a big amount of money cut out of community services. It's really been inadequate indexation, one-off, as Claire will know, we get sort of huge pressure and then the government will deliver some additional funds for particular purposes, but it's not necessarily sustained and ongoing. And the indexation arrangements are really crucial. Every year it's effectively a cut unless indexation is adequate. And of course, we're a predominantly women-identified sector, and predominantly driven by core values, which will be we turn up to help people. And it's time to call that out and say, and including in the crises we've faced, the pandemic, the bushfires, and on the goodwill of both paid workers, often not on very high pay, and the many volunteers in our sector. And it really is important that these services should not be taken for granted in this way.
I think the other issue that's really hit us in the last couple of years is the decrease in volunteers and voluntary contributions. We cannot find our volunteers now as we had before. But a recognition of the incredibly important role of the charitable sector is required, because we have played a very vital role on the front line of fighting the pandemic for the most vulnerable people in our community. But as Cassandra says, we need a proper review of where our service is at the moment and what is required. We've limped along for a long time on indexation, and there has been some extra money put in. There's no question about that. It needs recognising, but it's not.
Yes, demand is skyrocketing.
Demand is now skyrocketing. The cost of living crisis that we are currently in is a poverty crisis, and it's not going to go away anytime soon.
Thank you.
And it is, can I say, it's not reasonable to expect, and nor should it be, that frontline services responses are the ones to provide adequate incomes for millions of people, which is what our income support system is designed to do. And so, Senators, I think you will be hearing over and over from service providers also saying, fix the adequacy of income supports, deal properly with the structural problems driving a lack of affordable and social housing, and community services will be there in the way that they are designed to be for crises, that you get it right and they will pass.
Thank you. We've got about 6 minutes left, and I've got two questions I'd love to get a response to. One from ACOS, your recommendation for full employment, and just interested to see how you see that interacting with our income support system.
Peter, I might refer to you on that one.
Thank you, Cassandra. Full employment is, of course, critical to poverty alleviation. Everyone should have access to decently paid working hours that they need, and that will make a huge difference to poverty if we get there. We're not there yet. But so is the safety net important, and it's not an either or equation. Of course, there's less need for people to rely on the safety net if we have full employment, but it will always be needed and it should always be adequate. We have been advocating in the Jobs and Skills Summit and in our submission to the Reserve Bank review that there should be a full employment target sitting alongside the Reserve Bank's inflation target, and that they should be given equal weight so that whenever we approach a situation of full employment, we don't retreat from that by lifting interest rates too much, and there's a great risk of that right at the moment. And I'd just add that an effective safety net does help sustain full employment because it is the perfect automatic stabiliser in the economy. When there's a recession, if you have decent income support, it pumps money into the economy. More people are spending, especially people on low incomes who will readily spend, have to readily spend whatever additional income is provided to them. And then in the booms, of course, that automatic stabiliser pulls back because there are less people on those unemployment payments, as is the case now. If they were increased now, as we propose, the cost would be far, far less than would have been the case during the COVID recession, and that's as it should be because it's helping to stabilise the economy as well as provide that safety net that people need.
Thank you. And look, my final question to both of you, but ACOS, you mentioned in your submission that the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee could perform the function of a Social Security Commission with appropriate independence. I'm just interested in your thoughts about what that appropriate independence would look like.
Thank you, Senator. We think the committee is an important development. We welcome the commitment to have it legislated and for it to be independent. We think there should be definitely a process for expressions of interest for the constituting of the committee members, it should be clear about the length of the terms of those committees in the same way as other arm's length bodies from government, to have that, that independence sort of embedded in the structure and design of it. We have had a consistent view that it should have clear, dedicated spots for people directly affected, the representatives of people on very low incomes. That's really crucial. And that it should have its own appropriation in terms of resources. This committee, in our view, should not be seen as replacing the work, of course, the federal government, the Department of Social Services. We, of course, need government to do policy development and to do the data analysis and to have a really crucial role in all of this important work. We think the committee's role is to provide that advice in a transparent, open way and independent, obviously, at the right stages, including providing advice on budget measures in accordance with its mandate. I would highlight that in the same way as ACOS is a very strong supporter of the Voice to Parliament initiative, as crucial to the structural measures that we have talked about in terms of lifting the adequacy of income supports, of dealing with social housing, etc., participation of people, of and for with people on low incomes in policy and decision-making processes and in public debates is so crucial. Australia has to tell itself who it is. On the surface, we're a very wealthy country, and you will hear about the cost of living sometimes in the context of how much coffee has gone up. Well, we are talking about millions of people who have historically been at a point in time vilified. There is stigma attached to this experience, despite it being, widespread. And so we think the committee is an example of where we should have people on low incomes very much seen as the experts on this experience. We think that that's also a really crucial recommendation when it comes to, for example, debates about superannuation. Wouldn't it be great, actually, if we had people on low incomes, you know, driving the debates about superannuation? Because I think if you look at the relativities of experience here, the fact that we're even having a debate about whether it's okay to cap tax, you know, the concessionary treatment at 3 million, and here we are, you know, talking about millions of people who are unable to pay for the real essentials of life. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Goldie. Ms Little, did you have any comments you'd like to make about the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee and its independence?
We have called for a long time for some way of independently looking at income support payments that doesn't rely on the political winds of change or the political context of the day. So we know that since that nasty 2014-15 budget, we've been seeing significant ongoing and real cuts to social services resourcing. Payments and allowances have seen waiting periods introduced, revised and extended. Backdating has been removed. Entitlements have become less portable. Supplements have become less generous. Eligibility age ranges have narrowed and indexation has been paused, sometimes before being restarted and paused again. So what I'm saying is that it has been tampered with and tinkered with for a long time, but not raised in a way that it should be. And I think that we need an independent mechanism by which we can logically and rationally come to some sort of a sense of what our income support should be on an ongoing basis, and it should be reviewed properly, regularly, and then the government of the day respond accordingly and appropriately. And I think that would be absolutely our view. We've had that view for a long time. It's been 25 years of income support being just at the, let's put it up, let's put it down, let's change it. And I think it's time we stopped. If we wanted to be a country that genuinely believes that all its people have equal opportunity and genuinely believes that everyone has the right to participate and have opportunity in our country.
Thank you. Look, thank you all for your evidence today and your submissions and your excellent work on advocating for people who are living in poverty. So thank you very much. Any answers to questions on notice, if you could get them to the committee by the close of business the 17th of March, that would be appreciated. We will be reporting to the Senate on the 31st of October. So a bit of time to go yet. So the committee will now suspend and resume at 2 o'clock.
Thanks, Chair.
Awesome. Thanks, guys, for hanging out. Oh, we've got the music still. It's all consuming. So what I'm going to do is go. It's been a long morning. I'm going to read out to my friend Rin, who is a trans-American Aussie streamer and based in Sydney. He's doing an art stream today. So yeah, she does these lovely off-the-cuff drawings. It's really fun, and yeah, I think she would be a great fit for anyone who's been hanging out here, and I think you should head over there and say hi. Thanks so much for hanging